Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still get chills running down my spine whenever I think about that night. It's been over 36 years, but the memory is burned into my brain like it happened yesterday. Some things you just can't forget, no matter how much time passes. It was March 15th, 1987. I was 30 years old then, working on an oil rig near Dawson Creek, British Columbia. The job was tough but paid well, and I'd been there about 3 years by that point. We were on night shift that week, which always made everything feel a bit more isolated and eerie out there in the wilderness. That particular night was cold, typical March weather for northern BC. There was about 2 feet of snow on the ground, and the sky was clear with a nearly full moon. The moonlight reflecting off the snow made visibility surprisingly good, which is important for what happened next. It was just after midnight. I was making my rounds checking equipment on the east side of the rig when I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A movement along the tree line, maybe 50 to 75 yards away. At first, I didn't think much of it, probably just a moose or something. Wildlife wasn't uncommon out there, but something made me stop and look more carefully. I focused on the spot where I'd seen the movement, and that's when it happened. Something stood up, not gradually, but in one fluid motion, like it had been crouching and then just rose. In that moment, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a moose, it wasn't a bear. It was massive, upright, and more man-like than animal. I stood frozen, just staring. The thing was huge, at least 7 or 8 feet tall, maybe taller. Hard to tell exactly at that distance, but I'm 6'1", and this thing would have towered over me. The build was massive too. I'd guess around 350 to 400 pounds, with broad shoulders and a bulky frame. I remember thinking, this can't be real. But it was. Right there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me as I watched it. I called out to Brian Mustag, one of my co-workers who was working nearby. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I'm sure he heard the panic. Brian! Brian! Come here right now! When Brian turned around and started walking toward me, the creature moved. That's what convinced me this wasn't my imagination playing tricks. This wasn't a stump or a shadow. The thing turned and started running, not on all fours like a bear would, but upright on 2 legs with this unnervingly fluid motion that no human could replicate. The stride was what got me. Each step covered twice the distance a normal person's would. It wasn't lumbering or awkward, it was fast and efficient, like an Olympic sprinter, but with this primal, powerful quality that made my skin crawl. Brian reached me and followed my pointing finger. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. By then, 2 other guys from the crew had noticed us staring and came over. All 4 of us watched as this thing circled around the clearing where our rig was set up. It crossed the access road to the site, then disappeared into the trees, only to emerge again on the other side a few moments later. It crossed the road a second time, moving with that same impossible stride. The whole time, it seemed to be watching us, circling around like we were intruders on its territory. "Is that a bear?" one of the guys asked, his voice shaking. "No way," Brian replied. "Bears don't move like that." He was right. All 4 of us were experienced outdoorsmen. We'd all seen bears before, many times. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or could explain. The creature stopped at one point, still at the edge of the clearing, and just stared at us. I swear it felt like it was studying us, assessing whether we were a threat. That's when I felt it, this bizarre sensation running down my spine and across my shoulders. It was like touching a spark plug wire on a running engine, a literal electric shock of fear and adrenaline, pure, primal terror. After what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, the thing turned and headed into the denser forest. Without discussing it, we all grabbed our flashlights and decided to follow the tracks. Looking back, that was probably stupid, but curiosity and adrenaline do strange things to your judgment. The snow was deep, about 2 feet, and we were immediately at a disadvantage. Where the creature moved effortlessly, we struggled, sinking up to our knees with each step. It was like it was gliding over the snow while we floundered through it. We managed to follow the tracks for maybe 100 yards before giving up. The thing was just too fast, moving through that deep snow like it wasn't even there. The tracks themselves were disturbing, massive footprints, easily 2 feet long, with strides of about 6 feet between them. It just wasn't possible for a human to make tracks like that, especially not moving at that speed through deep snow. We headed back to the rig site and nobody said much. What was there to say? We'd all seen it and none of us could explain it. The mood was tense and we stayed close together for the remainder of the shift. Every noise from the surrounding forest made us jump. When our shift ended around 6 in the morning, we drove back to Dawson Creek in near silence. We were staying at a small hotel in town, and when we walked in, Agnes Smith, the night manager, took one look at us and asked what had happened. We must have looked like we'd seen ghosts. Brian was the first to speak up. "You're not going to believe this, Agnes, but we saw something out there tonight. Something, I don't even know how to describe it." We told her what we'd seen, and she listened without interrupting. When we finished, she nodded slowly. "You boys haven't been drinking, have you?" We assured her we hadn't, and she believed us. Agnes had known us for months at that point. We stayed at that hotel whenever we were working that rig, and she knew we weren't the type to make up stories or show up drunk after a shift. "I've heard stories," she said quietly, "from the locals. Things in the woods that can't be explained." I barely slept that morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing standing there, watching us. I kept feeling that electric sensation of fear running down my spine. The next day, word had somehow gotten out about what we'd seen. A reporter named Anne Ree from the Vancouver province showed up at the hotel. At first, I didn't want to talk to her. Who would believe us anyway? But Brian convinced me it was better to tell our story than have rumors spreading. Anne was surprisingly open-minded. She asked detailed questions without judgment, taking careful notes. Then she asked if we could take her to the site to see the tracks. We drove her out there, and remarkably, despite some overnight wind, many of the tracks were still visible. Anne measured them carefully, footprints approximately 2 feet long, with strides of about 6 feet between them. She also noted something we hadn't noticed the night before, strange V-shaped impressions near some of the footprints, which she suggested might be knee marks from where the creature had briefly knelt down. As she was taking photos of the tracks, I stood there looking at the tree line, half expecting to see the thing watching us again. That feeling of being observed hadn't fully left me, even in the daylight. "You know what people are going to say, don't you?" Anne said as we were preparing to leave. "They'll say it was a bear, or you were seeing things in the dark." "We know what we saw," Brian replied firmly. "All 4 of us, and it wasn't a bear." Anne nodded. "For what it's worth, these aren't bear tracks. I've seen plenty of those." Her article came out a few days later. It was more balanced than I expected, presenting our account alongside the measurements she'd taken without drawing firm conclusions. The headline was something like, "Oil Workers Report Strange Encounter Near Dawson Creek," deliberately vague, but not dismissive. Of course, there were still plenty of people who thought we were crazy or making it up for attention. Some of my friends back home in Alberta laughed it off when I told them. My own brother suggested we'd seen a moose in poor lighting conditions, but he wasn't there. He didn't see what we saw. The company that operated the rig brought in some extra security after our report, though they never officially acknowledged why, just said it was a precautionary measure. But we noticed the new floodlights installed around the perimeter of the site, illuminating the tree line that had been dark before. In the weeks that followed, I kept replaying that night in my mind. The way it moved, the impossible speed and fluidity, the sense of intelligence in the way it circled us, watching, assessing. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, swearing I could feel those eyes on me again. I stayed on at that job for another 8 months before moving to a different site. During that time, we never saw the creature again, though there were nights when noises from the forest would make us all stop and listen. A cracking branch, a distant sound that wasn't quite a howl, but definitely wasn't any normal wildlife call we recognized. Brian claimed to have seen something similar near his home in northern Alberta a year later, but he couldn't be sure it was the same creature. 2 of the other witnesses eventually denied the whole thing happened, saying they couldn't remember or had been tired and confused. I understand why. It's easier than having people look at you like you're crazy for the rest of your life. But I know what I saw that night. I've spent over 3 decades trying to make sense of it. I've read books about Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. Some of the descriptions match what we encountered, but nothing quite captures the reality of standing there, watching this impossible thing moving with such power and purpose. The hardest part to explain to people who weren't there is that feeling, that electric shock of fear that ran through my body. It wasn't just being startled or scared in the normal sense. It was deeper, more primal, like my body recognized a predator that my mind couldn't classify, and the way it watched us. That's what still gets me when I think about it. The intelligence behind those observations. It wasn't just an animal stumbling across humans and running away. It was circling, studying, almost like it was checking us out, determining if we were a threat to its territory. There was purpose there, intention. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, in those woods near Dawson Creek. If it's watching other workers, other campers, other people who venture too deep into its territory. I wonder if they feel that same electric fear running down their spines when it turns its gaze on them. I've never gone back to that specific area. I've worked other oil fields, other remote locations, but something in me resists the idea of returning to that particular spot. Call it superstition if you want, but that night changed something fundamental in how I see the world and the wilderness. There are things out there that we don't understand, that science hasn't classified or explained. Things that move through the deepest parts of the forest, rarely seen, but always present. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, or lucky depending on how you look at it, you catch a glimpse of them. A brief moment when the natural world reveals something that shouldn't exist, but undeniably does. That's my story. Take it or leave it. I know what I saw, what Brian saw, what all 4 of us witnessed that night in March of 1987, and no amount of skepticism or rational explanation can erase the memory of that creature standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with an intelligence that had no business being in the body of something so wild and primal. Sometimes late at night, I still feel that electric shiver run down my spine, and I know it's the memory of being watched by something that was checking us out, evaluating us, deciding whether we belonged there. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that we didn't. Story 2. The thing I wasn't supposed to see. I've been holding this in for too long. I need to get it off my chest, even if most people won't believe me. I was a works supervisor for the Department of Highways in British Columbia back in 1970. My job involved checking road conditions, overseeing maintenance crews, and generally making sure the highways were safe. I'd been doing this work for 15 years by that point. I knew those roads like the back of my hand. January 7th, 1970. That date is burned into my memory. It was a cold, clear winter day, around 2 in the afternoon. I was driving along Highway 99 between Squamish and Peton, checking on some recent repairs near the Cheakamus Canyon. This area is pretty remote, steep slopes, thick forests, and the rushing Chicamus River cutting through the canyon below. I was alone in my department truck, just doing my usual rounds. The highway there winds through dense forest, with steep drop-offs on one side and rocky slopes on the other. I was completely alert. You had to be on those roads. I've always prided myself on being observant. As a hunter for most of my life, I was trained to notice movement, to spot things that didn't belong. That's when I saw it, something on the shoulder of the road ahead. My first thought was bear. We get plenty of black bears in that area, and occasionally grizzlies too. Nothing unusual about that, but something about the way it was moving caught my attention. I slowed down, approaching carefully. As I got closer, maybe about 80 feet away, the thing suddenly dropped to all fours and turned its back to me. This behavior struck me as odd right away. Bears don't typically react that way. I stopped the truck, keeping the engine running, and watched. I figured it would scamper off into the woods like bears normally do when they hear vehicles. It didn't. For about 30 seconds, it just stayed there, on all fours, back turned to me. I remember thinking that maybe it was injured or sick. I was reaching for my radio to call it in when everything changed. The creature stood up, not the way a bear stands up. This was different. It rose to its full height in a fluid motion, then slowly turned to face me. The moment it turned, I felt a cold shock run through my entire body. My hands froze on the steering wheel. This was no bear. It was standing completely upright, like a man, but much, much larger. From where I sat in my truck, I could see it was massive, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The build was enormous, with shoulders that must have been 3 feet across and a protruding belly. I'd guess the weight at around 700 to 800 pounds. But it wasn't just the size that hit me. It was how human-like it appeared despite being clearly not human. It had a sloped forehead, almost a pointed skull, with prominent brow ridges. The face was flat with a wide, flat nose. But the eyes were what got me. They looked disturbingly human, set deep under those heavy brows. Its entire body was covered in reddish-brown fur, maybe 3 to 4 inches long. In its right hand, and I distinctly remember this detail because it seemed so bizarre, it held a fish, a decent-sized one, with the head and tail sticking out from either side of its closed fist. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without warning, it moved. The creature crossed the highway, a good 40 feet of pavement, in just 4 or 5 strides. The speed was incredible, not running exactly, but covering ground in a way that didn't seem possible for something that size. It reached the other side of the road where there was a steep embankment, probably about 10 feet high. It went up this slope, using its left hand just once to steady itself, still clutching that fish in its right hand. Then it was gone, disappeared into the thick forest above the embankment. I sat there in my truck completely frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking uncontrollably on the steering wheel. I think I stopped breathing for a while. What the hell had I just seen? After maybe 30 seconds of sitting there in shock, I finally managed to put the truck in gear. I drove away slowly at first, then faster, wanting to put distance between myself and that spot. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it running after me. The thing that haunts me most wasn't just its size or speed. It was the expression on its face when it looked at me. There was something there. Anger or fear, I'm not sure which, but it was unmistakable. A clear emotion on a face that shouldn't have been capable of such human expression. I've hunted all my life. I've seen every animal native to British Columbia up close. Bears, cougars, moose, you name it. This wasn't any of those, not even close. Once I'd put a few miles between me and the encounter site, I pulled over at a small turnout. My hands were still shaking. I remember sitting there trying to rationalize what I'd just witnessed. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of deformity. Maybe the light was playing tricks. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, but I knew better. I'd seen it clear as day in broad daylight from 80 feet away. No mistaking what I saw. I considered radioing it in, but stopped myself. What would I say? Hey, I just saw a giant hairy man creature carrying a fish. They'd think I was drunk or crazy. I had a good reputation with the department. 20 years of service without a single disciplinary issue. I wasn't about to risk that. Instead, I finished my rounds in a daze. I checked the road repairs near Peton, made my notes mechanically, and headed back to the office in Squamish. The whole time, my mind kept replaying those few seconds of the encounter, the way it stood up, the way it looked at me, the impossible speed as it crossed the road. When I got back to the office, a couple of co-workers commented that I looked pale. I blamed it on a touch of flu and left as soon as I could. I drove home on autopilot, barely aware of the road. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking at me. I got up around midnight and did something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I wrote in a diary. I needed to get every detail down while it was fresh in my mind. The height, the build, the color of the fur, the fish in its hand, the expression on its face. Everything. The next day, I seriously considered going back to that spot. Part of me wanted proof, tracks, hair, anything that would validate what I'd seen. But a stronger part of me was terrified of encountering it again. What if it wasn't alone next time? What if it was less inclined to run away? I never reported the incident officially. Who would believe me? But over the next few weeks, I quietly asked around. I spoke to some of the old-timers in the area, particularly the native folks who'd lived there for generations. I was careful how I phrased things, just asking if they'd ever heard stories about strange creatures in the Chiacamas Canyon area. Most gave me strange looks or brushed off the question. But one elder, a man who must have been in his 80s, gave me a long, searching look before saying, "Some things in these mountains are best left alone." He wouldn't elaborate, but the way he said it sent chills down my spine. A few days after the encounter, I went to the library and started researching. I found old newspaper clippings about wild men sightings in British Columbia dating back to the 1800s. Some of the descriptions matched what I'd seen. The height, the reddish fur, the human-like gait. They called it different names, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or simply the wild man of the woods. I even tried to recreate the encounter to better understand what I'd seen. I took a tall friend of mine, he was 6'4", to a similar stretch of road and had him stand where the creature had been. Based on that comparison, I realized my initial estimate was conservative. The thing had been at least 8 feet tall, possibly taller. What bothers me most, even now, all these years later, is that moment of recognition. When I looked into its eyes, there was intelligence there. Not animal intelligence, but something different. It knew exactly what I was. It made a decision to leave rather than confront me. It was carrying a fish it had presumably caught. These aren't the actions of a simple animal. For weeks after the encounter, I'd jerk awake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I could hear heavy footsteps outside my house. Every time I drove that stretch of Highway 99, I'd find myself slowing down near the spot, scanning the tree line, both hoping and fearing I might see it again. I never did. But that single sighting changed me. I became more cautious in the woods, more aware of my surroundings. I never went hunting alone again. Something about knowing that creature was out there, watching, waiting, living its life unseen, made the wilderness feel different, less conquerable, less known. I've tried telling this story a few times over the years. Most people react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. My wife believed me, thank God. She knew me well enough to know I wouldn't make something like this up. A few close friends accepted it too, especially those who'd spent enough time in the deep wilderness to know there are things out there we don't understand. When I hear scientists or skeptics dismiss Sasquatch sightings as misidentifications or hoaxes, I just shake my head. They weren't there that day on Highway 99. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel that moment of primal fear when something impossible stands before you in broad daylight, challenging everything you thought you knew about the world. I'm 78 years old now. I've had a long career, raised a family, lived a good life. But that January afternoon in 1970 still feels as vivid as yesterday. Sometimes I wonder if the creature is still out there, still roaming those forests, still catching fish from the Chicamus River. How old do these things live to be? Does it remember our encounter the way I do? Over the years, I've become more comfortable with uncertainty, with not knowing. The world is full of mysteries, and maybe some of them aren't meant to be solved. But I know what I saw that day was real as the truck I was driving, as real as the fish in its hand. I returned to that exact spot about 5 years after the encounter, not looking for the creature, just, I don't know, seeking some kind of closure, maybe. It was summer, the canyon lush and green. I stood where my truck had been and looked across to where it had climbed the embankment. In the daylight, with birds singing and traffic occasionally passing, it all seemed so normal, so ordinary. But as I stood there, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, that feeling you get when you're being watched. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing. Still, the feeling persisted until I got back in my car and drove away. I never went back after that. There are things in this world that exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Things that move through the deep forests, the remote mountains, the places humans rarely go. Things that have learned to avoid us, to stay hidden, to survive on the edges of our world. I saw one of those things on January 7th, 1970. I wasn't supposed to. It was a chance encounter, a random moment when its world and mine briefly intersected. But having seen it, I can't unsee it, can't unknow what I now know. And that's the hardest part, living with the certainty that what I saw was real, while knowing that most people will never believe me, carrying this knowledge that doesn't fit with the world as most people understand it. So I keep my diary entry from that night. I look at it sometimes, rereading my frantic scribbles, reassuring myself that it happened, that I'm not crazy, that for a few brief seconds on a winter afternoon, I glimpsed something extraordinary, something that wasn't supposed to exist, but undeniably does. Story 3. Of the thing that knows where I live. I've never really told this story in full before. I'm 62 now, and I've lived in this small mountain town in Southern California most of my life. What happened back in 1981 has haunted me for over 40 years, and sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear it outside. It was late January, and we were in the middle of the worst winter storm I can remember. The wind was howling so hard it sounded like a freight train was circling the house. Snow was coming down sideways, piling up against the side of our place in drifts that were already several feet high. We'd lost power earlier that evening, so I was sitting in the living room with just a couple of kerosene lamps and the fireplace going, trying to keep warm. Around 11 at night, the storm seemed to get even worse. The windows were rattling, and I remember thinking we might lose some of the older pines behind the property. I'd just gotten up to put another log on the fire when I heard it. This sound. God, I don't even know how to describe it properly. It started as a deep, guttural roar that quickly turned into a scream. Not like a woman screaming, nothing human at all, but not like any animal I'd ever heard either. It was coming from the woods behind our backyard, maybe 100 yards into the tree line. The sound was so powerful that I swear I could feel it vibrating in my chest, like when you stand too close to the speakers at a concert. I froze where I was standing, log still in my hand. My first thought was maybe it was just the wind doing strange things through the trees, but then it happened again, louder this time. and with it came the sound of trees breaking, not small branches, but the unmistakable sound of entire trunks snapping. It sounded like two enormous creatures were tearing through the forest, using trees as weapons against each other. That's when the coyotes started. We always had coyotes in the area, and normally they kept their distance. But that night, they surrounded the house. I could hear them circling, their howls almost frantic. It wasn't their usual nighttime yipping. This was different, almost like they were panicking. I don't know how to explain what happened next, but something in me just knew. I knew with absolute certainty that what was out there in those woods was a Bigfoot. I'd never even believed in such things before, had laughed at the TV shows about them, but in that moment, I knew. It wasn't a conscious thought process. It was a primal recognition that bypassed all logical thinking. The roaring and tree breaking continued for almost an hour. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, and in those silences the only sound was the wind and the coyotes still circling and howling. Then it would start again, closer each time. I stood frozen in that same spot for what felt like forever, physically unable to move. The fear wasn't like being startled or scared by a movie. It was deep, instinctual terror that locked every muscle in my body. I finally managed to make it to the window, staying well back in the shadows. I couldn't see much through the driving snow, just the vague outlines of the trees closest to the house, swaying violently in the wind. But then I caught movement at the edge of the woods, something large, much larger than a person, moving between the trees. The shape was wrong for a bear, too tall and upright despite the storm's fury. Eventually, after what must have been 3 hours, the sounds stopped. The coyotes quieted down too, though I could still hear them moving around outside. I sat in the dark until dawn, my shotgun across my lap, though I'm not sure what good I thought it would do. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind nearly 3 feet of fresh snow. I tried to go out and look for tracks, but everything had been buried or blown smooth by the wind. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The isolation, the darkness, the howling wind, they can make you imagine things. I almost convinced myself of that. Almost. Then, about 3 weeks later, it happened again. It was another windy night, though no snow this time. Just powerful gusts that made the house creak and moan. I was alone again, my German shepherd keeping me company. She was a tough dog, the kind that would chase off bears and stand her ground against anything. I'd never seen her afraid of anything. I was in bed reading when I heard a heavy thud on the roof. At first, I thought a branch had fallen, but then I heard another sound. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving across the roof. 2-legged footsteps. Our house had a steep A-frame design with the peak about 25 to 30 feet high. Whatever was up there was walking upright along the highest point of the roof. My dog heard it too. She jumped up, hackles raised, but instead of barking like she normally would at an intruder, she started whining. Then she did something I'd never seen before. She crawled under the bed, trembling so hard I could see the bed frame shaking. This dog that would face down anything was terrified. The footsteps continued for maybe 5 minutes, pacing back and forth along the roofline. I could hear the weight of each step. This was no raccoon or squirrel. Each footfall made the ceiling timbers creak. Then, as suddenly as they started, they stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night, lying awake with my shotgun, listening for any sound of it returning. My dog stayed under the bed until morning. The third incident happened about a month after that. By then, I was constantly on edge, jumping at every sound, especially on windy nights. I'd been borrowing my dad's old Volkswagen bus while my truck was in the shop. It was one of those classic VW vans with the big rear window. I'd driven to the store and come back after dark. Our driveway curved around behind the house, ending near the back porch. I pulled in and was about to back up to get closer to the steps when I realized I'd forgotten something in the front seat. I put the van in reverse, took my foot off the brake, and started to turn around to grab it. The van rolled backwards slightly, and the reverse lights came on, illuminating what was behind me. That's when I saw it. Pressed up against the rear window of the van was a massive, hairy chest. Reddish-brown fur pressed flat against the glass. The window was about 4 feet off the ground, which means whatever this thing was, its chest was at that height. I couldn't see its head. It was too tall for the window to capture. But it was right there, inches from me, separated only by that thin pane of glass. If I'd continued backing up, I would have bumped right into it. For a split second, I just stared at the reflection in my rearview mirror, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Then pure survival instinct kicked in. I slammed the van into first gear and floored it, shooting forward down the driveway and back onto the main road. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour before I worked up the courage to return home. When I finally did go back, I left the van's headlights on, illuminating the area while I made a dash for the house. There was nothing there by then, of course. No tracks in the gravel that I could discern, no sign that anything had been there at all. The thing that terrifies me most about these encounters isn't just what I saw and heard, it's the realization that this thing, whatever it is, knows where I live. It's been watching my house, learning my routines, and it seems to prefer approaching during windstorms, using the noise as cover. After that third encounter, I installed motion sensor lights all around the property. I got more dogs. I even considered moving, but this was my home, and where would I go that would be any safer? Whatever this thing was, it had found me once. It could find me again. The encounters stopped after that last one with the VW bus, at least the direct ones did. But there have been other things over the years. Strange sounds in the night, unexplained knocking on the walls during storms, times when all the wildlife around the house goes suddenly, unnaturally silent. Sometimes I'll be working in the yard and get that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched from the tree line. I've done research over the years, read accounts from others who've had similar experiences. Some call these creatures Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Some indigenous traditions speak of wild men or forest giants. I don't know what to call what I encountered. I just know it was real, and it was intelligent enough to be deliberate in its actions. The weird thing is, I never felt like it was trying to hurt me. It could have easily broken into the house during that first storm, if it wanted to. It could have attacked me when I was alone in that VW bus, but it didn't. It seemed more like it was curious, checking me out, maybe even trying to communicate in its own way. But that doesn't make it any less terrifying. There's something profoundly disturbing about knowing you're being observed by something that shouldn't exist, something that defies everything you've been taught about the natural world. I've never had any desire to prove what I saw, never set up cameras or tried to lure it back. Some people who hear my story don't understand that reluctance. They ask why I didn't try to get evidence or tell more people. The answer is simple: pure self-preservation. When you're actually in the presence of something like that, all those noble aspirations of discovery and proof vanish. All that matters is survival. For years, I didn't tell anyone except my closest family what happened. Who would believe me? Even now, putting this all down, I expect most people will think I'm making it up or that I was hallucinating. That's fine. I know what I experienced. I still live in the same house, still hear the coyotes at night, though they never act the way they did during that storm. Still flinch when the wind picks up and the trees start swaying. Still keep my shotgun close, though I'm not convinced it would do much good if that thing ever decided to come back. Sometimes when I'm out in the yard, especially at dusk, I find myself looking toward the tree line, half expecting to see a tall, shadowy figure watching me from just inside the forest edge. I never do, at least not clearly enough to be sure, but the feeling of being observed never quite goes away. The most unsettling part of all this is how it's changed my relationship with the forest around my home. I used to love hiking these mountains, camping under the stars. Now, I rarely venture deep into the woods alone. When I do go hiking, every snapping twig or distant sound puts me on high alert. I'm constantly scanning the trees, looking for movement, for any sign that I'm not alone. What haunts me most is the certainty. Before this happened, if someone had told me they'd seen a Bigfoot, I'd have laughed it off. Now I know better. I know there are things in these mountains that don't fit into our neat scientific categories, things that are smart enough to stay hidden, to choose when and where they reveal themselves. I'm 62 years old now. I've had a good life here, despite the fear that occasionally creeps in. I've learned to live with the knowledge that something strange shares these woods with me. Most nights are peaceful now. But when the wind picks up and the trees start thrashing against a dark sky, I still find myself listening, waiting, because I know it's still out there. And worse, it knows exactly where to find me. Last winter, during a particularly bad storm, I thought I heard that same deep roar again, distant but unmistakable. The dogs went crazy, barking at the back door, but refusing to go outside when I opened it. I stood in the doorway, peering into the darkness, the wind whipping snow into my face. For just a moment, I thought I saw a massive shadow moving between the trees at the edge of my property. Then it was gone. I closed and locked the door, checked all the windows, and sat up all night with my shotgun across my knees, just like I did 40 years ago. The difference is, now I know what's out there, and knowing is the scariest part of all. Story 4. 15 seconds of staring into the unknown. I've waited years to share this. Partly because I didn't think anyone would believe me, partly because I didn't want to believe it myself. But what happened that day in Allegheny National Forest has eaten away at me for over a decade now, and I need to get it off my chest. My name's Dave. I'm a hunter from Pennsylvania, been hunting these woods since I was a kid. I'm also a veteran, served as a Special Warfare Combatant Craft Crewman, SWCC, for several years. I mention this because I want you to understand. I'm trained to handle high-stress situations. I don't panic easily. I don't imagine things. And I'm comfortable in the outdoors, comfortable with wildlife, comfortable with being alone in remote places. Or at least I was until June 2010. It was a perfect day for riding. Sunny but not too hot. Maybe mid-70s. I'd taken my ATV 500 out to cruise some trails in the Allegheny National Forest. If you're not familiar with the area, it's about 500,000 acres of dense forest in northwestern Pennsylvania. Beautiful country, but remote in parts. I'd been on these trails dozens of times before, knew them like the back of my hand. I was on a stretch of gravel between the Marinville and Timberline trails. It's a connector path, not very wide, with thick forest on both sides. In some spots, there are open fields of tall grass that break up the tree line. I was riding alone, but my buddy Paul was supposed to be somewhere behind me on his own quad. We'd gotten separated when he stopped to adjust something on his gear, and I'd told him I'd wait up ahead. So I pulled over at a wider section of the trail, killed the engine, and took off my helmet. It was around 2 in the afternoon, dead quiet except for the usual forest sounds. Birds, wind through the trees, that sort of thing. I remember checking my watch and thinking Paul was taking his sweet time. That's when the first rock hit my quad. It wasn't thrown hard, more like tossed. It made a dull thunk against the plastic fender. I turned around thinking Paul had caught up and was messing with me. No one there. Then another rock bounced off the seat, coming from the direction of a field of tall grass to my right. Very funny, I called out, thinking maybe some local kids were playing pranks. There was a field of grass about 2 to 3 feet tall, extending maybe 70 to 90 feet from the trail to another line of trees. The grass was moving slightly in the breeze, but I didn't see anyone. Then a third rock whizzed by in my peripheral vision. This one had some force behind it. It came from the same area of tall grass, but closer now, like whoever was throwing them was moving toward me. I stood up, annoyed now. "Hey!" I shouted. "Cut it out!" I started walking toward where the last rock had come from, expecting to see some teenager duck down in the grass. Instead, the grass parted and something stood up. My brain didn't process it correctly at first. The shape was all wrong. For a split second, I thought it was a person in some kind of costume. But no costume moves like that. It was a bipedal creature standing fully upright. The first thing that struck me was the color, a dark blue-black, almost like it was wet, though it wasn't raining. It had no neck to speak of, just a head that seemed to sit directly on massive shoulders. It was tall, I'd estimate between 7.5 to 8 feet, and proportioned all wrong. The arms were too long for the body, hanging down with the hands almost at knee level. The forearms especially seemed disproportionately long compared to the upper arms. The entire body was covered in hair or fur, about 3 to 5 inches long, with a strange sheen to it that caught the sunlight. Not like wet hair exactly, more like a natural gloss. But it was the face that froze me in place. It wasn't covered in fur like the rest of the body. Instead, it was what looked like black skin, smooth and taut. The eye sockets were large and deeply shadowed, making it impossible to clearly see the eyes themselves, just dark hollows where eyes should be. The mouth was just a thin line running from side to side of the face, no visible lips. It was looking directly at me, not glancing, not scanning, locking eyes with me in a way that felt deliberate and intelligent. Its right hand was empty, no rocks, but the fingers were moving slightly, almost like a subtle, unconscious fidgeting. I know exactly how long we stared at each other because later I timed it out. 15 seconds. 15 seconds of complete stillness and silence that felt like an eternity. I didn't move. It didn't move. Just this connection, for lack of a better word. A mutual acknowledgement. My training, all my experience, it just evaporated. I had a dot, 45 in my shoulder holster. I had my phone in my pocket. I had all sorts of options, but in that moment none of them existed. I was completely locked in place, barely breathing. Then something changed. I don't know if it was a shift in my expression or body language, or if the creature just decided our interaction was over, but it moved. 3 deliberate steps backward, still fully upright, still looking directly at me. Not breaking eye contact until the very last moment when it turned and was gone into the tree line behind the field. The movement was so fluid, so controlled, not the lumbering gait you'd expect from something that size, more like an athlete, efficient, balanced, purposeful. When it disappeared, the spell broke. Fear flooded through me like ice water. I ran back to my quad, fumbling with my helmet, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced it was going to emerge from the trees again, this time coming for me. I got the ATV started and took off down the trail, going faster than was safe on gravel. The whole time I had this overwhelming sensation that at any moment a hand was going to grab the back of my quad and yank me off. I could almost feel it, those long, powerful fingers closing around my shoulder or the back of my neck. I met up with Paul about 10 minutes later at our planned meeting point. He asked why I looked so freaked out, and I just mumbled something about nearly wiping out on a sharp turn. I couldn't bring myself to tell him what I'd seen, not then. How do you tell someone you just had a staring contest with something that isn't supposed to exist? The rest of the day is a blur. I remember Paul talking about his new scope or something, but I was barely listening. My mind kept replaying those 15 seconds over and over, the way it stood up, the strange proportions, those shadowed eye sockets fixed on me. I've spent a lot of time since then trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a bear with mange. No, bears don't stand that way, don't have those proportions, don't throw rocks. A person in a suit? The movement was too natural, too fluid. The The size was wrong. And who would be out in the middle of Allegheny National Forest in a costume that detailed just to scare a random ATV rider? I didn't tell anyone about this for years. Not my wife, not my hunting buddies, no one. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy, or worse, that they'd believe me, and I'd have to fully acknowledge what I'd seen was real. But here's the thing that's haunted me most about that encounter. It wasn't the creature's size or strange appearance that terrified me most. It was the deliberateness, the intelligence behind those eyes, the way it threw rocks, not to hit me, but to get my attention, the way it revealed itself when I approached, like it was curious about me, the way it maintained eye contact, studying me. This wasn't a random animal sighting. This was an interaction, a meeting of two intelligent species, sizing each other up. I'm a hunter. I've come face to face with bears, coyotes, all kinds of wildlife. I've been in combat situations overseas. I know what animal fear looks like, and I know what human calculation looks like. What I saw in that field was neither, yet somehow both. For 15 seconds I was completely helpless. Not physically. I was armed. I was capable. I could have acted. But mentally, I was utterly disarmed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. My brain simply couldn't process it fast enough to trigger a response. It was like suddenly finding yourself underwater when you were expecting air. That moment of disorientation and primal panic. I've gone back to Allegheny many times since then, never alone though, and never on that particular stretch between Marionville and Timberline. I tell myself and others it's because the trail conditions aren't great there, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is that I'm afraid of seeing it again, not because I think it would hurt me. It had every opportunity that day and didn't make any aggressive move. I'm afraid because seeing it again would confirm beyond any doubt that it's real, that it's out there, that the world is not what I thought it was. I've researched similar encounters since then. There are reports from all over Pennsylvania, especially in the Allegheny region. Some describe creatures similar to what I saw, others are different. More reddish-brown, more hair on the face, different proportions. Maybe there are different types. Maybe they're individuals with their own unique appearances, just like humans. What gets me is how many of these reports mention rock throwing. It seems to be a common behavior. Some researchers think it's a way of communicating or showing curiosity without direct confrontation. Others think it's territorial, a warning to leave the area. I don't know which it was in my case. It didn't feel aggressive, but it didn't feel exactly friendly either. Just evaluating. I've thought a lot about why I froze the way I did. I'm not easily rattled. My military training taught me to react quickly in unusual situations. But this was beyond unusual. It was paradigm shifting. In that moment, I wasn't just seeing a strange animal. I was seeing proof that everything I thought I knew about the world was incomplete. And there's something profoundly terrifying about that. Not the fear of physical harm, but the fear of having your entire worldview shattered in an instant. The realization that you're not at the top of the food chain, not even in your own backyard. That there are things sharing our world that have managed to remain hidden despite all our technology and exploration. Things that are watching us, even as we remain oblivious to them. I still go hunting, still ride my ATV, still enjoy the outdoors. But I'm different now, more alert. More aware of the shadows at the edge of clearings, the subtle movements in tall grass, the feeling of being watched that sometimes prickles the back of my neck for no apparent reason. I carry my dot, 45 everywhere in the woods now. Not that I think it would do much good against something that size, that fast, but it's comforting somehow. Sometimes when I'm in the forest, I'll find small piles of rocks stacked on stumps, or arranged in patterns that don't seem natural. Once, on an overnight hunting trip, I found 3 trees bent and twisted together in a way that couldn't have been caused by wind or snow load, little things that most people would overlook or rationalize away. I can't do that anymore. I know what's out there now, or at least I know that something is out there, something intelligent enough to stay hidden, to observe us without being observed, to decide when and where to reveal itself. That's what scares me most when I think back to those 15 seconds. Not that I saw something unexplainable, but that it chose to let me see it. It made a decision to stand up, to lock eyes with me, to let me know it was there. And then it chose to walk away, back into a world that runs parallel to ours, but remains largely invisible to us. I still don't know why it chose me for that brief interaction. Was it just curiosity? Territory? Something else entirely? I'll probably never know. But one thing I know for certain, we are not alone in these woods. And sometimes, if they're curious enough or we're observant enough, the separation between their world and ours momentarily thins. Just enough for 15 seconds of eye contact that changes everything. I haven't been back to that specific spot since that day. I don't think I ever will. Not out of fear that it would hurt me, but fear that it wouldn't be there. That I'd stand in that same spot, looking at that same field, and start to doubt my own memory. Start to think maybe it was just a weird shadow or a trick of the light. Because the alternative, that it was real, that it's still out there, watching, waiting, evaluating, that's almost too much to live with. Almost. Story 5. The morning everything changed. I never thought I'd be sharing this story with anyone. For over 10 years, I've kept quiet about what I saw that Sunday morning. Partly because I didn't want people thinking I was crazy, and partly because putting it into words makes it more real somehow. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone out there has seen something similar. It was March 4th, 2012. The date is burned into my memory because it completely changed how I see the world around me. I was visiting my mother's apartment near South Park in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She lived on the 4th floor of a complex that overlooked a wooded hillside. Not deep wilderness by any means, just your typical suburban patch of trees and undergrowth that separates neighborhoods. That morning was totally normal. Clear skies, around 40 degrees, and I was enjoying a cup of coffee by the window while my mum was getting ready for church. It was about 8:30 in the morning, and I was just staring out at the hillside, not really thinking about anything in particular. That's when I noticed something unusual. A group of wild turkeys, I counted 15 of them, suddenly appeared at the edge of the woods, moving down the hill at a pace that seemed off. If you've ever watched wild turkeys, you know they usually move pretty deliberately, pecking and strutting as they go. These birds were different. They were moving with purpose, almost rushing down the slope toward the apartment complex. My first thought was that someone was up in the woods hunting them illegally, even though it wasn't turkey season. I kept watching, curious about their behavior, when something else caught my eye. 3 deer emerged from the same spot where the turkeys had appeared. They were moving quickly too, not quite running, but definitely hurried. Now, I've been hunting since I was a teenager. I know deer behavior. When deer move like that, alert, fast, but not full-on bounding, they're responding to a threat that they're not in immediate danger from, but that they definitely don't want to be near. I remember thinking, maybe a coyote. We get them around Pittsburgh sometimes, and they'll definitely spook deer, though not usually in daylight. I kept my eyes fixed on that spot at the tree line where both groups of animals had emerged. About 5 minutes passed. The turkeys were already at the bottom of the hill, and the deer had moved out of sight to the left. I was still staring at that same spot, coffee getting cold in my hand, when I saw movement. What emerged from the woods wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't anything I could immediately identify, and I spent 20 years as a police officer in the area. I know every animal native to western Pennsylvania. This thing was big, much bigger than a coyote or a dog. It was on all fours initially, covered in dark hair or fur. My first split-second thought was bear, but it moved all wrong for a bear. Its gait was smooth, almost cat-like, but larger than any bobcat or mountain lion that could possibly be in Pennsylvania. It took about 3 strides to reach the top of the hill, moving with an efficiency that was unsettling. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It partially stood up. Not completely upright like a human, more like 2/3 up, but definitely on 2 legs. And then it ran, on 2 feet, toward the deeper woods to the right. The movement was fluid, fast, and completely unnatural for any animal that should exist in Pennsylvania. It covered ground quickly, and I only saw it for maybe 7 seconds total before it disappeared into the thicker trees. I stood there, frozen, coffee mug gripped so tight, my knuckles were white. My mind was racing, trying to categorize what I'd just seen. The closest thing my brain could compare it to was a gorilla, but there are obviously no wild gorillas in Pennsylvania. The proportions were similar, the broad shoulders, the powerful build, the way it moved with its arms, but this wasn't an escaped zoo animal. This was something else. The most terrifying part wasn't actually seeing the creature itself. It was the logical progression my mind followed immediately after. Those turkeys and deer had been running from something. That something had just revealed itself. And that something had casually invaded a residential area in broad daylight, seemingly unconcerned about human presence until it reached the hilltop, and then decided to retreat. I was suddenly acutely aware that I was looking down on this scene from my mother's apartment, with the window wide open. I'd been hunting enough to know that many predators can detect human scent from incredible distances. Had it smelled me? Had it known I was watching? I waited, half expecting to catch a whiff of something. Most large mammals have a distinct odor. But there was nothing. Just the usual morning smells of dew and pine from the hillside. After a minute or two, my mum came into the room asking if I was ready to leave for church. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because she immediately asked what was wrong. I couldn't tell her. How do you explain something like that? Especially when you've spent 20 years as a police officer, trained to report facts, not wild speculations about impossible creatures. Just thought I saw a coyote, I told her. Pretty big one. We went to church, and I went through the motions of the service without registering a single word. My mind kept replaying those 7 seconds over and over again. The way it moved on all fours, not lumbering like a bear, but smooth and controlled. The way it rose up on 2 legs, not struggling for balance, but transitioning naturally, like it was equally comfortable either way. The speed with which it covered ground once upright. The dark outline against the morning sky. After church, I went back to the window and stared at the hillside for hours. Part of me wanted to go out there, to look for tracks or hair or any evidence of what I'd seen. But another part, the part that had kept me alive through 20 years of police work, told me that was a terrible idea. I've always trusted my instincts, and my instincts were screaming that whatever I saw was a predator, a smart one that had been pursuing those turkeys and deer until it realized it had ventured too close to human habitation. One that had made a calculated decision to retreat rather than continue the chase. That's what keeps me up at night, even now. Not just that I saw something that shouldn't exist, but that what I saw showed intelligence, awareness, decision-making capabilities. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was something that assessed its situation and changed its behavior accordingly. Over the years, I've done research, looking into reports of similar sightings around western Pennsylvania. There are more than you'd think, though most people keep quiet about them for the same reasons I did. Fear of ridicule, fear of having their credibility questioned, and maybe, on some level, fear of having their experience validated. Because if what I saw was real, then everything I thought I knew about the world around me is incomplete. I've considered all the rational explanations. A bear with mange or some other condition that altered its appearance. A large dog or wolf though wolves have been extinct in Pennsylvania for over a century. A person in some kind of costume or ghillie suit, though that doesn't explain the fluid movement or the perfect transition from 4 legs to 2. Nothing fits, except the explanation my mind doesn't want to accept, that for 7 seconds on a Sunday morning in March, I glimpsed something uncategorized by science, something that shares our world but stays hidden at the edges of our awareness. I've never gone hiking in South Park since that day. I used to love the outdoors, spent every free weekend hunting or fishing, but now I get an uneasy feeling every time I'm near the woods. I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, half expecting to see that shape again. The way it moved haunts me the most. People who haven't seen these things often imagine them to be clumsy or lumbering, like a man in a costume would be. But what I saw moved with the confidence and grace of something perfectly adapted to its environment. The fluid transition from quadrupedal to bipedal locomotion, the speed and silence of its retreat. This was no costume, no misidentified known animal. And those turkeys and deer knew exactly what it was. They didn't react the way they would to a human hunter or a normal predator like a coyote. There was a different quality to their retreat, urgent but not panicked, like they were maintaining a specific distance, almost as if they were familiar with this predator and knew exactly how much space they needed to keep between themselves and it. That's another thing that bothers me. If these creatures exist, they must have been around for a long time, long enough for the local wildlife to have developed specific responses to them, long enough to have carved out a niche in the ecosystem, yet somehow they've remained undocumented, unacknowledged by mainstream science. How is that possible? How can something that size remain hidden, especially in a relatively populated area like the outskirts of Pittsburgh? The only answer that makes sense is that they're incredibly intelligent and deliberate about avoiding human detection. And that thought is almost more unsettling than the creature itself, because it means they're watching us, learning our patterns, our behaviors, while we remain largely oblivious to them. Since that day, I've become more observant of subtle signs in the woods. I notice when birds suddenly go silent. I pay attention to deer trails and the way they sometimes divert around certain areas for no apparent reason. I look twice at broken branches that are too high up to have been snapped by a human or a deer. Sometimes, usually around dusk or dawn, I'll get a feeling of being watched when I'm near wooded areas. It's not something I can explain rationally. Just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, a sudden awareness that the woods around me might not be as empty as they appear. I keep a journal now of unusual animal behavior I observe. Clusters of wildlife sightings in areas they don't typically frequent. Times when the neighborhood dogs all start barking at once for no apparent reason. It sounds paranoid when I say it out loud, but after what I saw, I can't help but look for patterns. People often ask why, if these creatures exist, no one has ever found a body or clear physical evidence. I've thought about this a lot. In my 20 years as a police officer, I responded to countless deaths in the wilderness. Hikers, hunters, people who wandered off trails. Without exception, when human remains are found in the woods, they're found because other humans are actively searching for them. Nature is incredibly efficient at recycling its dead. Between scavengers, insects, weather, and decomposition, even large animals can disappear completely in a matter of weeks. If these creatures retrieve and hide their dead, as some highly intelligent animals do, and if they avoid humans as effectively as my experience suggests they do, it's not surprising that physical evidence remains elusive. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what I saw and how it affected me. 7 seconds that changed my entire worldview. 7 seconds that I can't explain away, can't rationalize, can't forget. Last week I was driving near South Park at dusk. I hadn't been in that specific area for months, maybe longer. As I passed the wooded area near my mother's old apartment building, she moved to Florida a few years after my sighting, I slowed down, eyes automatically scanning the tree line like they always do now. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement. Something dark shifting between two pines, something tall. My heart rate spiked and I pulled over, rolling down my window to get a better look. Nothing was there, or at least nothing I could see. But as I sat there, idling on the shoulder of the road, a group of turkeys emerged from a different section of woods, moving quickly across an open field. Behind them, 3 deer followed the same path, moving with that same purposeful haste I'd seen years before. I didn't stay to see what might emerge next. I rolled up my window, pulled back onto the road, and drove away as quickly as I legally could. Some patterns are too specific to be coincidence. Some memories too vivid to be imagination. I don't know what's in those woods. I don't know if it's the same thing I saw 10 years ago or others of its kind. I don't know if it remembers me as clearly as I remember it. But I know one thing for certain. I'm not the only one who's seen it, and I won't be the last. Story 6. The 5 seconds that haunt me. I don't talk about this much. Actually, I've only told this story to maybe 3 people in the last 20 years, and each time I could see that look in their eyes, that sure buddy look that people get when they think you're full of shit, but are too polite to say it. But what happened that night in 2001 is as real as anything I've ever experienced, and it fundamentally changed how I think about the world around us. My name's AJM. I'm a US Army veteran, did 8 years active duty and saw combat in the First Gulf War. I mention this because I want you to understand I'm trained to observe, to react under pressure, and to accurately report what I see. I don't spook easily, and I don't make stuff up. It was late October 2001. My then wife and I were driving back from visiting her parents in Virginia. We were heading north on Interstate 81 towards Scranton, Pennsylvania, where we were living at the time. It was probably around 11 at night, maybe a bit later. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional truck passing us or taillights in the distance ahead. The stretch of Interstate 81 we were on is pretty rural, cutting through the Appalachian Mountains with steep embankments on either side. In some spots, there's a drop-off of several hundred feet right next to the highway. It's beautiful country during the day, but at night, it's just dark shapes against a darker sky, your headlights cutting a tunnel through the blackness. We'd been driving for hours, and to stay alert, we were talking about nothing important, just shooting the breeze, about a TV show we'd been watching, making plans for the weekend, that sort of thing. I was driving, both hands on the wheel, completely focused on the road. We were coming around a bend in the highway, one of those gentle curves where you don't really need to slow down. My headlights swept across the right shoulder of the road as we turned. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a shape, something big at the edge of the road. My brain tried to categorize it as a deer, maybe a bear, but it didn't fit either profile. As we got closer, the details came into focus, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A massive, muscular leg covered in dark hair was planted right at the edge of the pavement. Connected to it was an equally huge arm and wrist, with a hand that looked capable of crushing a bowling ball. The positioning was odd, like something was crouched at the roadside, leaning over to look down the embankment. We were doing about 70 miles per hour, so this all happened in a split second. But sometimes, in moments of extreme stress or surprise, time seems to slow down. That's what happened here. I remember every detail with perfect clarity, like a series of photographs burned into my brain. The thing, because I still don't know what else to call it, must have heard or sensed our approach. It turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of a massive shoulder and the side of what could have been a head, though I never saw the face clearly. What happened next defies everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The creature straightened up, it had been bent over, turned away from us, and then descended the steep embankment. Not by climbing down carefully, not by sliding down on its rear like a human would. It went down in long, controlled strides, on 2 legs, bipedal. like a person would walk downstairs, except this was nearly a cliff, and it moved with the confidence of something that had done this 1,000 times before. The embankment at that spot had to be at a 45-degree angle or steeper, dropping hundreds of feet down to the valley below. Nothing human could have navigated it that way, especially not in the dark. Nothing I've ever seen moves like that. My wife saw it too. She screamed, a short, sharp sound, and grabbed my arm so hard her nails dug in through my jacket. I instinctively hit the brakes, hard enough that the car fishtailed slightly before I got it back under control. I pulled over onto the shoulder, right about where the thing had been standing seconds before. My military training kicked in, and I reached behind the seat for my shotgun, a 20-gauge Mossberg that I kept secured but accessible for emergencies. I wasn't thinking about shooting whatever it was necessarily, but I wanted protection if it came back up to the road. But my wife was in full panic mode. She grabbed my other arm, begging me not to get out of the car, not to go anywhere near the edge. She was crying, repeating, "What was that? What the fuck was that?" over and over. I didn't get out. Part of it was her reaction, sure. But if I'm being completely honest, another part of me, the primitive, survival-oriented part, was screaming that getting out of the car would be a very bad idea. Still, I kept my eyes locked on that spot where it had disappeared, straining to see any movement in the darkness below. From what I glimpsed in those few seconds, I'd estimate the thing was at least 7 to 8 feet tall. The build reminded me of a linebacker, broad shoulders, thick chest, powerful limbs, but much, much bigger, and covered in hair or fur. Not patchy like a mangy bear, but a full coat, dark in color, though exact color was impossible to tell in the headlights. What keeps me up at night, even 20 years later, is the complete lack of fear it showed. We were in a 2-ton vehicle moving at highway speed, with bright headlights and a loud engine. Any normal wild animal, bear, deer, whatever, would have bolted away from the road, not calmly turned, and walked down an almost vertical slope like it was taking a Sunday stroll. It showed zero concern about our presence, zero hesitation, like we were so insignificant it didn't even need to hurry. After a few minutes sitting there, heart pounding, I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the highway. My wife kept looking back over her shoulder like she expected to see it climbing up to the road behind us. I kept checking the rearview mirror for the same reason. We drove the rest of the way to Scranton in near silence. What was there to say? We'd both seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, something that made a mockery of everything we thought we knew about the wildlife in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in the wild. Bears can stand on their hind legs briefly, sure, but they don't walk bipedally down steep embankments with the ease this thing showed. The proportions were all wrong for a bear, too. The shoulders too broad relative to the hips, the arms too long and articulated. It wasn't a person in a costume. The size alone rules that out. But more importantly, no human could have navigated that slope the way this thing did. Not in the dark, not at that speed, not with that confidence. And who would be out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, in a costume that detailed? When we got home, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a bear and the darkness and surprise made it seem different. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow that looked like something else, but we both knew what we'd seen. My wife just didn't want to talk about it. Ever. She shut down any attempt to discuss it after that night. I couldn't let it go so easily. I went to the library. This was before widespread internet use, and looked up information on wildlife in the Appalachian region. Nothing matched what we'd seen. I found some local history books that mentioned old legends, stories the settlers had heard from Native Americans about wild men or forest people. But these were treated as folklore, not fact. A few weeks later, I actually drove back to that stretch of highway in daylight. I wanted to see the embankment, to confirm my memory of how steep it was. It was exactly as I remembered, a near vertical drop that would be challenging for a human to descend even with proper equipment and daylight. The idea of anything going down it in the dark, on two legs at a walking pace, was absurd. But I saw what I saw. The worst part wasn't the sighting itself. It was the feeling afterward, the knowledge that I had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, something that operates just at the edge of our awareness, and the maddening brevity of it all. 5 seconds, maybe less. Not enough time to fully comprehend what I was seeing, but enough to know it was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. I'm a trained soldier. I had a shotgun in the car. Under different circumstances, if my wife hadn't been there, if we hadn't been moving at high speed, I might have investigated further, might have gotten a better look, might have had something more concrete than a fleeting glimpse to hold on to. That combination of extreme proximity, it was literally feet from our car, and complete indifference to our presence is what truly terrifies me. We weren't a threat or even an object of curiosity to this thing. We were just there, and it had its own business to attend to. Over the years, I've heard other stories. Hunters in remote areas who found strange structures deep in the woods that no human had reason to build. Hikers who felt watched for miles, only to find massive, human-like footprints around their campsite the next morning. Truckers on overnight hauls who swear they saw something impossibly large cross the highway in front of them. I listen to these stories differently than most people. I don't dismiss them automatically. I don't assume these people are lying or confused or saw a bear in poor lighting, because I know what it's like to see something your brain can't process, something that doesn't fit into any category you've been taught exists. My wife and I divorced a few years after this incident. It wasn't because of what we saw. We had plenty of other problems. But I sometimes wonder if that night accelerated our growing apart. When you experience something like that with another person, it either brings you closer together through shared understanding or drives a wedge between you, if one person wants to forget while the other can't stop thinking about it. I'm remarried now, living in a different state. Far from that stretch of I-81, I've never told my current wife about what happened. How do you bring something like that up? Hey, by the way, I once saw a creature that science says doesn't exist. It's not exactly dinner conversation, but I think about it often, especially when I'm driving on dark, rural highways. I find my eyes constantly scanning the roadside, my body tense with anticipation. Not fear, exactly, more like heightened awareness. Because once you've seen something that shatters your understanding of what's possible, you can never go back to blissful ignorance. I've considered reaching out to research organizations that investigate these kinds of sightings. There are several reputable ones that don't sensationalize reports or jump to conclusions, but something always holds me back. Partly it's concern for my privacy and reputation, partly it's the knowledge that my account, a few seconds of observation while driving at high speed, doesn't add much to the collective understanding. And partly, if I'm being completely honest, it's the lingering sense that these things don't want to be found, studied, categorized, that they exist in parallel to our world, occasionally intersecting but largely separate. That night, I didn't get the impression I was seeing an animal that was simply undiscovered by science. I got the impression I was seeing something that actively avoids human detection, something intelligent enough to understand the concept of remaining hidden. The nonchalance with which it descended that impossible slope has stayed with me all these years. It wasn't running away in fear. It was simply continuing on its way, unconcerned with being briefly spotted, like it knew that a momentary sighting by two humans in a passing car posed no real threat to its existence or way of life. And maybe it was right. 20 years later, all I have is this story. A story most people don't believe. A story I can barely believe myself some days. No proof, no validation. Just the unshakable memory of those few seconds and the absolute certainty that what I saw was real. I still check my rearview mirror more than I need to, especially at night. I still glance at the woods when I drive past, wondering what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. Not out of fear, exactly. More out of awareness that the world is bigger, stranger, and more mysterious than most of us ever realize. Until, for a few seconds on an otherwise ordinary night, the veil lifts, and you see what's always been there, hiding in plain sight. Story 7. The day I ran from something impossible. I've kept this story, mostly to myself, for over 50 years now. A few family members know parts of it, but I've never shared the full experience with anyone outside my immediate circle. I guess I'm still processing what happened that autumn day in 1971, still trying to make sense of something that defies explanation. It was early October, one of those perfect fall days in western Pennsylvania when the leaves are changing but haven't quite fallen yet. I was 14 at the time, and my best friend and I were always looking for adventures in the woods around Allegheny County. We lived near Allison Park, and there was this gas pipeline that cut through the forest off Bryant Road that we used as a trail. The pipeline created a wide, clear path through the trees, like a man-made corridor that was perfect for hiking. That Saturday, we decided to follow the pipeline deeper into the woods than we usually went. It was around 2 in the afternoon, sunny but cool enough for light jackets. The pipeline corridor was maybe 30 feet wide, just grass and occasional small bushes, with dense forest on both sides. We'd brought some sandwiches and sodas, planning to just hang out somewhere along the path and maybe explore some of the small game trails that branched off into the woods. We found a good spot about a mile in, where a fallen tree trunk crossed the edge of the clearing. It made a perfect bench. We sat down, eating our lunch and talking about school and girls and whatever else 14-year-old boys talked about back then. It was peaceful, just the sound of the breeze through the trees and occasional bird calls. That's when we heard it for the first time, a sound that still plays in my head all these years later. It was like a large bird call, but not quite right. Almost like someone trying to imitate a bird, but not getting it quite right. It was loud enough to make us both stop talking mid-sentence and look at each other. "What was that?" my friend asked. I shrugged. I'd grown up in these woods and knew most of the local wildlife sounds. This wasn't a turkey or an owl or any bird I recognized. A few minutes later, we heard it again, but this time it was followed by something else. A distinct knocking sound, like someone hitting a tree trunk with a stick or a rock. Knock, knock, knock. 3 clear impacts, then silence. "Probably some other kids messing around," I suggested, though the sound had come from deep in the forest, where there weren't any trails. We went back to eating, but now we were both listening more carefully to the woods around us. Over the next 20 minutes, the pattern continued. The bird-like call, then the knocking, sometimes 3 knocks, sometimes 5 or 6 in a row. What began to unnerve us was that the sounds were clearly getting closer, and they seemed to be coming from the same direction each time. If it was another person, they were deliberately moving toward us through some pretty dense underbrush. What really got our attention was when we realized the sounds weren't just getting louder because they were closer, they were actually increasing in volume, like whatever was making them was putting more force behind them. The knocks started to sound less like someone tapping a tree and more like someone striking it hard enough to be heard from a distance. "Let's go check it out," my friend suggested, always the braver of us two. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to seem scared, so I agreed. We left our backpacks by the log and started walking toward the edge of the forest where the sounds were coming from. We'd only gone about 10 feet toward the tree line when the sound stopped completely. The woods went eerily silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just dead silence. We both stopped, suddenly hesitant. "Hello?" my friend called out. No response. That's when I got that feeling. You know the one, like you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to run in the opposite direction. I glanced at my friend and could tell he felt it too. "Maybe we should go back," I whispered, not even sure why I was whispering. He nodded, and we slowly started backing up toward our backpacks. That's when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow between two large trees at the edge of the forest, maybe 30 yards away. But then the shadow moved, and I realized it was something standing there, partially hidden by the trunk of a massive oak tree. Something big, something watching us. As my eyes focused, I could make out more details. It was tall, much taller than either of us, probably around 7 feet. It had a human-like shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but the proportions were off. The arms seemed too long for the body, hanging down farther than a person's would. The entire figure was covered in what looked like grey fur or hair, maybe 2 to 4 inches long. I couldn't see its face clearly. I've had astigmatism since I was a kid, and details at that distance were always blurry for me. But I could tell it was looking directly at us. There was an awareness there, an intelligence in the way it stood so still, observing, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds. We all just froze. The creature staring at us staring at it. There was this moment of mutual recognition, this impossible, horrifying understanding that we were seeing something that shouldn't exist, and it was seeing us too. Then everything happened at once. My friend screamed, not a word, just a primal sound of fear. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, and the creature, it moved. It didn't ease back into the forest or slip away between the trees. It exploded into motion, turning and charging straight up the hillside behind it. The sound is what I remember most vividly. This tremendous crashing as it plowed through the underbrush, snapping branches and small trees like they were twigs. It wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. It was fleeing at full speed, and the forest itself seemed to be breaking apart in its wake. We didn't stick around to watch. We grabbed our backpacks and ran in the opposite direction, back down the pipeline corridor toward Bryant Road. We ran until our lungs burned, not daring to look back, convinced somehow that if we slowed down for even a second, that thing would be right behind us. When we finally reached the road, we stopped, bent over, gasping for breath. My friend's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Did you see that?" he panted. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. My mind was racing through possibilities. A bear? No, bears don't stand like that, don't have that body shape. A person in some kind of ghillie suit? No, it was too tall, too massive, and who would be out in these woods in a costume? There was no hunting season open, no reason for anyone to be disguised. We made a pact right there on Bryant Road. We wouldn't tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe us anyway? We'd be laughed at, or worse, people would think we were lying for attention. But that pact didn't last long. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grey figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us with an intelligence that felt almost human, but wasn't. I kept hearing the tremendous crash of its retreat, the raw power in the way it moved through the forest. The next morning I broke down and told my parents. I expected disbelief, maybe even anger at what they'd assume was a made-up story. Instead, my father got very quiet, and my mother exchanged a look with him that I couldn't interpret. "Your uncle saw something in those same woods last year," my father finally said. "He didn't want us to tell anyone because he thought people would think he was crazy." Over the next few weeks, I learned that there had been other sightings in the area. Not many, and most people kept quiet about them, but they were there if you knew who to ask. My friend's older brother had heard strange calls in the night when camping near North Park. A neighbor had found unusual tracks crossing his property after a rainy night. Tracks too large to be human, but with 5 distinct toes, not at all like a bear's paw. My parents, to my surprise, took it seriously enough that my father went back to the pipeline with me the following weekend. We didn't go all the way to where we'd seen the creature, but we found an area where the ground was soft enough that it might hold tracks. And we did find something, a series of impressions in the mud near the tree line, roughly 17 inches long and 8 inches wide, not clear enough to show individual toes or details, but distinctly foot-shaped and far too large to be human. My father, who had always been practical and skeptical about anything that couldn't be logically explained, took plaster casts of those tracks. He kept them in his workshop, and sometimes I would catch him studying them when he thought no one was around, a troubled expression on his face. We never went back to that specific spot on the pipeline. My friend and I found other places to explore, always in more open areas, always with an escape route clearly in mind. But I never stopped thinking about what we saw that day. As I got older, I did research, read books about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings, compared notes with the few similar stories I could find. Some details matched: the height, the gray fur, the knocking sounds that many researchers believe these creatures use to communicate with each other. Other details were unique to our encounter, like the bird call sound that preceded the knocking. I'm 65 years old now. I've had a full life, college, career, marriage, kids who are now adults themselves. I've traveled the world and seen amazing things, but nothing has ever affected me as profoundly as those few moments in the Pennsylvania woods in 1971. What haunts me isn't just the sight of the creature itself, though that was terrifying enough. It's the sensory memory of its retreat, the explosive power, the sound of vegetation being crushed under its weight, the sheer force of its movement through the forest. It was like nothing I've ever experienced before or since. When a bear runs through the woods, it makes noise, sure. But this was different. This was like a freight train plowing through underbrush, snapping small trees as if they were matchsticks. And there's something else that stayed with me all these years, the certainty I felt in that moment that we had crossed some invisible boundary, that we had come too close to something that normally stays hidden, something that wants to remain separate from the human world. The fear I felt wasn't just my own terror. Somehow I knew that the creature was equally alarmed by our presence, equally desperate to restore the distance between our worlds. Sometimes I think about how close we came to something truly extraordinary. If we had been quieter, if we had approached more carefully, could we have observed it longer? Could we have learned something about a species that science still doesn't acknowledge exists? But then I remember the sound of its retreat, the raw power in its flight. And I think maybe we were lucky to walk away with nothing but a frightening memory. I've never gone back to that pipeline, though I still live in Pennsylvania, not far from where it happened. Sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas with my grandkids and we pass a stretch of dense forest, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that gray figure watching from the shadows. The kids ask me why I always slow down near the woods, and I just tell them I'm looking for deer. But I'm not looking for deer. I'm looking for something I hope I never see again, yet can't stop searching for. Because once you've glimpsed something impossible, something that challenges everything you thought you knew about the world, you can never fully go back to not knowing it exists. That day in 1971, I didn't just see a creature that science says isn't real. I heard it, felt its presence, experienced its power. And in that brief moment of mutual recognition before we all ran in opposite directions, I understood something fundamental, that the line between the known and unknown world is thinner than we think. And sometimes, when we least expect it, we can step across it and find ourselves face to face with the impossible. Story 8. What we found in Curry Hollow. I don't talk about this much. It happened in the mid-80s when I was a teenager, but I still get this sick feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it. I've tried to explain it away a million times, tried to convince myself it was just a bear or maybe even a homeless person, but deep down, I know better. What we saw that day in Curry Hollow wasn't something that's supposed to exist. My friend and I were always exploring places we probably shouldn't have been. We were both around 15 years old, both 5'5", skinny kids who thought we were invincible. That particular area of Curry Hollow was our latest obsession, a steep, densely wooded section that was tough to access. We'd been gradually working our way down into the hollow, using ropes tied to trees at the top of the ridge. Each weekend, we'd go a little further, mapping out the area in our heads, finding the best routes down. It was a Saturday in June, warm, but not too hot yet. We'd packed sandwiches and sodas, planning to spend most of the day exploring. We'd already mapped the upper section of the hollow pretty well, so this time we were determined to reach the very bottom where a small stream ran through. We had about 100 feet of rope between us. Not professional climbing gear or anything, just some thick nylon rope we'd bought at the hardware store. We started early, around 8 in the morning. The descent was slow going. We weren't experienced climbers, just stupid kids with more courage than sense. We'd secure the rope to a sturdy tree, then lower ourselves down as far as we could before finding another anchor point and repeating the process. The hillside was steep enough that in some places it was almost a cliff, with loose rocks and dirt that would slide away under your feet if you weren't careful. By noon, we'd made it maybe 3/4 of the way down. The forest was thick here, a mix of maples, oaks, and some pines, with dense undergrowth that made it hard to see very far in any direction. There was a section where a large tree had fallen some time ago, creating a sort of natural bridge across a particularly steep part of the slope. The tree was covered in vines and moss, and we decided this would be a good spot to take a break and eat our lunch. As we sat there, catching our breath and looking around, something caught my eye about 20 feet below us. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves or maybe a fallen branch, but there was something off about it. It was a brownish color, but it didn't quite match the surroundings. I nudged my friend and pointed. "What's that down there?" I whispered, not really sure why I was whispering. He squinted, then shrugged. "Dunno. Looks like maybe a dead deer or something." Whatever it wasn't moving. It was just this odd, brown, furry-looking mass nestled near a tangle of underbrush. We decided to check it out after we finished eating. When we were done with our sandwiches, we secured our rope to the fallen tree and started to make our way down toward the strange object. We'd only gone about halfway down when I started to get this weird feeling, like something wasn't right. The forest had gotten quieter. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, just this heavy silence that seemed to press in around us. "Maybe it's a bear," my friend suggested, sounding less certain now. "Maybe it's hurt or something." Ah, that made sense. A wounded bear could explain both the strange shape and the unusual silence in the forest. Animals tend to stay away from predators, especially injured ones that might be more aggressive than usual. "If it's a bear, we should go back up," I said, starting to feel nervous. We were only about 10 feet away from it now, and if it was a bear and it decided to charge us, we'd be in serious trouble. My friend nodded, and we were just about to turn around when the thing moved. Not much, just a slight shift, like something breathing, but it was enough to freeze us both in place. We stood there, completely still, neither of us sure what to do. The bear hadn't seemed to notice us yet. It was still just this brown, furry mass, partially hidden by the underbrush. I remember thinking it looked oddly positioned for a bear, more hunched or curled than a bear would normally lie. "Let's back up slowly," I whispered, barely making any sound at all. My friend nodded, and we both took a careful step backward. That's when it happened. The thing, whatever it was, suddenly stood up, not like a bear rising on its hind legs, but in one fluid motion, like a person standing from a crouch. In an instant, what I had thought was a wounded animal transformed into something else entirely, something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. It was tall, at least 2 feet taller than either of us, putting it around 7.5 feet. It was covered in brown fur or hair, and it had a distinctly human-like shape. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head that sat directly on broad shoulders. It stood perfectly upright, not hunched over like a bear would be if it was on its hind legs. For a split second, maybe less, it just stood there, its back to us. Then it turned its head slightly, as if it had just become aware of our presence. I didn't see its face clearly. It was partially obscured by hair, and it didn't turn all the way around, but I saw enough to know this was no bear, no deer, no animal I'd ever seen before or could even name. Then it moved. I've spent years trying to find the words to describe how this thing moved, but nothing quite captures it. It was fast, impossibly fast. One moment it was standing there, and the next it was gone, bounding through the underbrush with a speed and agility that defied belief. It covered maybe 20 yards in what felt like the blink of an eye, crashing through the forest with surprisingly little noise given its size and speed. My friend and I didn't even speak. We turned as one and scrambled back up the rope, pulling ourselves up with a strength born of pure terror. I remember my hands burning from the friction of the rope, my lungs heaving as I gasped for breath. But mostly I remember the certainty that if we didn't get out of there immediately, something terrible would happen. We didn't stop at the fallen tree. We kept going, pulling ourselves up rope after rope, not even bothering to properly secure them anymore, just desperate to reach the top of the ridge and the relative safety of open ground. My friend was ahead of me, and I kept expecting to feel something grab my ankle from below, to be yanked back down into the hollow. Nothing grabbed me, nothing followed us as far as I could tell, but the entire time we were climbing, I could hear movement in the forest below, not directly beneath us, but off to the side, moving parallel to the ridge. Whatever it was traveling fast, circling around, rather than coming straight up after us. When we finally reached the top, we collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, our muscles burning from the climb. We didn't speak for several minutes, both of us just trying to process what we'd seen. "What the hell was that?" my friend finally managed to say. I shook my head. I didn't have an answer, or rather I did have one, but it wasn't an answer I was ready to accept. We gathered our remaining gear and headed home in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. That night I barely slept, the image of that thing standing up playing over and over in my mind. The fluid way it moved, the impossible speed, the weird silence that had preceded its appearance. None of it made sense if it was just a bear or some other known animal. A few days later, my friend suggested we go back with more people. Safety in numbers, he reasoned, and part of me wanted to, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to prove to myself that what we'd seen had a rational explanation. So we rounded up 3 other friends, told them we'd found something strange in Curry Hollow, and headed back. This time, we were more cautious. We moved slowly, making more noise than necessary, alerting anything in the area to our presence. When we reached the spot where we'd seen the creature, there was nothing there, of course. But we did find something else. A large, flattened area in the underbrush, like a bed or nest. It was big enough that several deer could have bedded down there, but there was something off about it. The ground wasn't just flattened, it was almost shaped, with what looked like a depression in the center and a raised area at one end, almost like a pillow. We looked for footprints, but the ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves and pine needles that didn't hold impressions well. One of our friends pointed out broken branches on some of the nearby bushes, about 6 to 7 feet off the ground, higher than a deer could reach, even standing on its hind legs. We didn't stay long. Something about the place felt wrong, like we were trespassing in someone's or something's territory. Even our friends who hadn't seen the creature seemed to feel it, this sense of being unwelcome, of being watched. We left before reaching the bottom of the hollow, none of us willing to admit why we were so eager to get back to open ground. That was my last trip to Curry Hollow. My friend went back once more, alone, which I thought was insane, and came back white as a sheet, refusing to talk about what, if anything, he'd seen. A month later, his family moved to Ohio and we gradually lost touch. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we saw that day. A bear is the obvious explanation, but it doesn't fit. Bears don't move like that, not with that speed and fluidity. And while bears can stand on their hind legs, they don't stand fully upright with the proportions this thing had. This was something else. I've read accounts of Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings over the years, and some details match. The height, the fur, the speed. But I've never been comfortable putting that label on our experience. Saying we saw Bigfoot feels like reducing something profound and terrifying to a punchline, a tabloid headline. What we saw was real. It was there, in those woods, going about its business until we stumbled too close. The speed with which it fled, the clear intelligence in its decision to circle around rather than climb directly up the slope. These speak to something more complex than just an undiscovered animal. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, in Curry Hollow or the forests beyond. I wonder if other hikers or explorers have glimpsed it over the years, had their own moments of terror and disbelief. I wonder if it remembers us, two stupid kids who came too close to something that didn't want to be seen. I'm in my 50s now, with a career and family that have nothing to do with that day in the hollow. I've never gone looking for another encounter, never joined any Bigfoot research groups or gone on expeditions. One brush with the unknown was enough for me, but I've never forgotten either. How could I? That day fundamentally changed how I see the world, how I understand what might be out there in the dark spaces between human settlements. The woods don't feel empty to me anymore. They feel occupied, watched, managed by something that moves through them, unseen except on the rarest of occasions. Something that knows the terrain in a way we never will, that can vanish in seconds despite its size, that chooses when and where it will be glimpsed. If you're ever hiking in western Pennsylvania and you come across a section of woods that's unusually quiet, where the birds stop singing and the air feels heavy with attention, turn around. Go back the way you came. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. Some residents of this world prefer to remain unseen, and some memories will haunt you for the rest of your life, no matter how hard you try to explain them away. Story 9. Like the white thing that shouldn't exist, I've never been the type to believe in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm pretty grounded, always have been. But what I saw in September of 1997 has haunted me for over 25 years now, and I still don't have an explanation that makes any logical sense. It was a clear night in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. I remember because the stars were unusually bright, and there was a 3/4 moon, providing enough light to see my entire backyard clearly. It was around 9 in the evening, and I was on my back deck having a cigarette before bed. A nightly ritual I'd had for years. My property backed up to a small wooded area, maybe 5 acres of dense trees that separated our neighborhood from the next one over. Nothing special, just your typical Pennsylvania woods with oak, maple, and some pine trees. From my deck, I could see my neighbor's yard to the right, separated from mine by a simple chain-link fence. We didn't have privacy fences in our neighborhood. Everyone could see into everyone else's yards, which normally made the place feel safe and communal. I was just standing there, enjoying the cool September air, when it happened. This high-pitched shriek erupted from my neighbor's yard, maybe 30 yards from where I was standing. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal. The closest comparison I can make is to the sound of metal grinding against metal, but organic, if that makes any sense. It had this guttural quality underneath the high pitch that made my skin instantly break out in goosebumps. My first thought was that someone was being attacked, so I immediately turned toward the sound, scanning my neighbor's yard. That's when I saw it. There, moving across their lawn, was what I can only describe as a humanoid figure. But this was no human. It was enormous, standing between 8 and 9 feet tall, with proportions that were just Wrong. Too long, too thin in some places, too bulky in others. And it was white, not like paper white or even skin white, but a pale, almost glowing white that stood out starkly against the night. The thing was running, not sprinting exactly, but moving with this fluid, powerful gait that covered ground alarmingly fast. And the entire time it was moving, its head was turned in my direction. I couldn't make out a face, just the dark outline of a head against that pale body. But I absolutely knew it was looking straight at me. In a matter of seconds, it had crossed my neighbor's entire yard and reached the edge of the woods that bordered our properties. There was no hesitation, no pause. It just entered the tree line and disappeared into my section of the forest. I stood there, frozen, my cigarette burning forgotten between my fingers. Then I heard it moving through the woods, not the sound of footsteps exactly, but this sweeping, crushing noise, like vegetation being pushed aside by something substantial. It continued for maybe 10 to 15 seconds, getting fainter as whatever it was moved deeper into the trees. That's when the paralysis broke, and I ran inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I switched off all the lights and stood in the darkness of my kitchen, peering out the window toward the woods, half expecting to see that white figure emerge again. Nothing came out. The night went silent again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and I couldn't rationalize it away. The scream was what really got to me afterward. Years before, I'd heard a recording from 1978, supposedly captured in Washington State. One of those famous Bigfoot or Sasquatch recordings that circulate among researchers. At the time, I'd written it off as probably fake, or maybe some known animal distorted by poor recording equipment. But what I heard that night in my neighbor's yard was identical. The same pitch, the same modulation, the same unnerving quality that doesn't match any recognized wildlife. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room with all the doors locked and the lights off, watching the woods until dawn. I kept thinking about how it had looked at me while running, not just glanced. Its head had remained turned toward me for the entire time it was visible, like it wanted to make sure I saw it, like it was deliberately letting me know it was there. The next morning, I went out to check for evidence. In my neighbor's yard, where it had run, there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed grass, nothing out of place. But at the edge of the woods, I found something that made my blood run cold again. A section of underbrush was flattened, creating a path about 3 feet wide that led straight into the trees. Following this path, I found broken branches as high as 7 feet off the ground. Whatever had come through here was tall enough to snap branches that I had to reach up to touch. I followed the trail about 50 feet in before losing it, where the ground became rockier and covered with pine needles. But it was enough to confirm I hadn't imagined it. Something had moved through here, something big. I asked my neighbors the next day if they'd heard anything strange, trying to be casual about it. None of them mentioned the scream. Either they hadn't heard it, or they didn't want to talk about it. I didn't push. What would I say? Did you see the 9-foot white humanoid running through your yard last night? I'd sound insane. What disturbs me the most, even now, isn't just what I saw, though that was terrifying enough. It's the combination of factors that made the experience so unnerving. The color was wrong. Most Bigfoot reports describe brown or black creatures, not white ones. The attention it paid to me was deliberate. It wanted me to see it, to know it was there. And the movement through the woods. There was no sound of footsteps, just this rushing, sweeping noise, like something massive moving with surprising grace through dense vegetation. I've spent years trying to find a rational explanation. Could it have been a person in some kind of costume or ghillie suit? Maybe. But who would be over 8 feet tall, wandering through suburban Pennsylvania at night? And that scream, no human could make that sound. A bear standing on its hind legs. Bears don't move like that, don't maintain an upright posture while running, and they certainly don't have that color or proportions. For weeks afterward, I couldn't bring myself to go out on the deck after dark. I installed motion sensor lights all around my property, pointing especially toward the woods. I considered moving, but the housing market was down. And besides, where would I go? How could I explain to a realtor that I needed to move because I saw something impossible in my backyard? About a month after the incident, I was working up the courage to sit on the deck again during daylight hours. It was a Saturday afternoon, sunny and normal. As I sat there with a book, trying to reclaim this space that had become a source of fear, I noticed something odd about the woods. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels chattering, none of the usual forest sounds. Just this heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears. I stared at the tree line, that familiar prickle of fear crawling up my spine again. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as paranoia, I caught movement between two large oak trees about 100 feet in. Something pale, something large, moving slowly from one tree to another. It was there for maybe 2 seconds, then gone. I left the deck immediately and didn't go back out for nearly a year. I've done research since then, read accounts of similar sightings, joined online forums where people share their experiences. There are reports of white Bigfoot-type creatures, though they're rarer than the typical brown or black ones. Some researchers suggest they might be older individuals, their hair graying with age, like gorillas. Others propose they could be a different species altogether, or perhaps individuals with albinism. None of these explanations satisfy me because they all presuppose that these creatures exist in the first place, something I would have vehemently denied before my experience. Now, I don't know what to believe. I still live in the same house. The woods are still there, though development has eaten away at them over the years. Sometimes, usually around dusk or on particularly quiet nights, I get the feeling of being watched from those trees. I never see anything definite anymore. Just occasional movements at the edge of my vision, gone when I turn to look directly. One thing that has changed is how I perceive the woods themselves. Before, they were just trees, neutral, natural, unremarkable. Now they feel like they contain something, like they're not just a physical space, but a threshold of some kind, a boundary between the world I understand and something else entirely. I've tried telling this story a few times over the years. Most people react with polite skepticism or outright disbelief. A few have suggested I was tired, or my eyes were playing tricks, or maybe I dozed off and dreamed it. I understand their reactions. I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me. It sounds impossible, irrational, the kind of thing that happens in movies, not real life. But it did happen. I was stone cold sober, wide awake, and what I saw was as real as the keyboard I'm typing on now. That white figure running through my neighbor's yard, head turned toward me, wasn't a hallucination or a dream. The broken branches in the woods weren't imagination. And that scream, that terrible, piercing scream that sounded identical to a recording from thousands of miles away and decades earlier, that was real too. I've come to an uneasy peace with my experience. I don't expect validation or belief from others. I don't need it. I know what I saw, and that knowledge has fundamentally changed how I understand the world. There are things out there that we haven't classified, haven't explained, maybe haven't even properly encountered yet. Things that mostly stay hidden, but occasionally, for reasons of their own, allow themselves to be seen. The strangest part is that I wasn't afraid during those few seconds when I actually saw it. The fear came after, when my brain caught up with my eyes and I realized what I'd witnessed couldn't exist. In the moment itself, there was just this suspended sense of unreality, like the world had briefly shifted into some alternate version where different rules applied. It's been over 25 years, and I still think about it almost daily. Not with the raw terror I felt at first, but with a kind of wondering unease. What was it? Why was it there? Why did it want me to see it? And most disturbing of all, is it still out there, moving through those woods at night, occasionally crossing someone else's yard, letting itself be glimpsed before disappearing again? I don't smoke anymore, quit years ago, but sometimes on clear nights I still find myself drawn to the deck, looking out toward those woods, not hoping to see it again, God no, but unable to completely let go of the experience, unable to fully return to the person I was before that night in September. The world feels bigger now, more mysterious, less defined, and that white figure, head turned toward me as it ran, has become a dividing line in my life. Everything before I saw it and everything after. Two different people living in two different worlds, separated by 15 seconds of impossible reality on an otherwise ordinary night. Last week, I was taking out the trash after dark. It was the first cool night of fall, with that same clear sky and bright stars as that night back in '97. As I was closing the lid on the garbage can, I heard something from the direction of the woods. Not a scream this time, but a sound like wood knocking against wood. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, trash lid still in my hand. The sound came again, from deeper in the woods this time. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't wait to hear if there would be a third set. I went inside, locked the door, and drew all the curtains. Some things you don't need to see twice to know they're real. Some memories are vivid enough to last a lifetime, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 10. The night it came to our deck. I've been debating whether to share this for weeks now. What happened at the beginning of June 2023 still has me checking the locks twice every night and jumping at every sound outside our house. I'm writing this because I need to process it, and maybe because someone out there has experienced something similar and can tell me I'm not losing my mind. For context, we live in a fairly rural area with woods behind our property. Not deep wilderness, but enough trees and undergrowth to provide habitat for deer, raccoons, and the occasional black bear. We've always had a good relationship with our surroundings, respectful but comfortable. That changed completely in early June. The weird activity actually started about a week before the main incident. Our neighborhood, which is usually pretty quiet after dark, suddenly became active with strange sounds at night. It began with the dogs. Every house with a dog within a half-mile radius seemed to have issues with their pets acting strangely, barking at nothing, refusing to go outside after sunset, or howling in ways their owners had never heard before. Then came the other sounds. At first, I thought they were just owls, but something about them felt off. There were these whoop calls that would echo through the trees behind our house. They didn't match any owl species I'm familiar with, and I've lived in this area my whole life. Sometimes they'd come in patterns, 3 or 4 whoops, then silence, then an answer from further away. I didn't think too much of it initially. Wildlife behaves strangely sometimes, especially in late spring when new animals might be moving through territories. But then my next-door neighbor mentioned hearing weird monkey sounds at night, and I started paying more attention. By the first weekend in June, I was curious, but not yet concerned. My kids, aged 9 and 11, had been begging to camp out in the backyard, but with the unpredictable weather, I suggested a compromise. We'd set up our tent on the deck attached to the house. It would give them the camping experience while keeping us close to the safety and convenience of home. Plus, I thought it might give me a chance to hear these strange sounds more clearly if they happened again. We set everything up that Saturday afternoon, a 6-person tent that fit snugly on our wooden deck, sleeping bags, pillows, and a battery-powered lantern. The kids were excited, treating it like a real adventure, even though we were literally 10 feet from the back door. My daughter even insisted her cat join us, which I reluctantly agreed to. The evening started normally enough. We had dinner inside, then moved out to the tent around 8:30. The kids played card games while I read a book, occasionally glancing up at the woods behind our property. It was a clear night with a quarter moon, not bright enough to illuminate the tree line clearly, but enough that I could make out the general outline of the forest edge about 50 yards from the deck. The kids fell asleep around 10, but I stayed awake, still reading. The cat was acting strangely, pacing around the tent, occasionally stopping to stare intently at the zippered door. Around midnight, she suddenly made this weird, alarmed meow that I'd never heard from her before. Before I could grab her, she darted out through a small gap in the tent door that I hadn't noticed was partially unzipped. I got up to look for her, and that's when I heard it. Something moving through the woods toward our house. Not like a deer or even a bear would move. This was heavy, deliberate footsteps crushing undergrowth, snapping small branches. Whatever it was big, and it was coming straight toward us. Now, I need to make something clear. I'm not someone who scares easily. I grew up hunting and fishing. I know what bears sound like when they move through woods. I know what deer sound like when they're startled. This was different. The cadence was wrong for a four-legged animal. The weight behind each step was too heavy, and there was a purposefulness to the movement that made my skin crawl. I quickly zipped the tent door completely closed and reached for my shotgun, which I'd brought into the tent more out of habit than any expectation of danger. I always keep it with me when we camp, even if it's just in the backyard. Years of hunting have made it second nature. The footsteps continued, getting closer, and I estimated whatever it was had reached the edge of our yard. My heart was pounding so hard, I was afraid it would wake the kids. I chambered around in the shotgun as quietly as I could, but the metallic click seemed to echo in the night air. The footsteps stopped instantly. Whatever was out there had heard that sound and frozen in place. I held my breath, listening. Based on the last footstep I'd heard, I estimated it was about 15 to 20 feet from the deck. Close enough that if it rushed us, I'd have almost no time to react. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, there was complete silence. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling breath, almost like a sigh mixed with a growl. It was so deep I could feel it more than hear it, a vibration that seemed to pass through the wooden deck beneath us. It wasn't aggressive exactly, more annoyed, like whatever was out there was irritated that I'd heard it coming. I sat motionless, shotgun ready, staring at the tent wall as if I could see through it. The kids were still asleep somehow, their steady breathing a surreal counterpoint to the hammering of my heart. Then, from somewhere much deeper in the woods, came a chorus of sounds that turned my blood to ice. It started as a single, high-pitched howl. Not a coyote, not a wolf, nothing I've ever heard from a known animal. It was joined seconds later by another howl, this one deeper, more resonant. Then a third, somewhere between the first two in pitch. They overlapped, creating this eerie, almost harmonized wailing that echoed through the trees. The effect on the neighborhood was immediate and terrifying. Every dog within hearing distance, and it must have been dozens, began howling and barking in response. The cacophony was deafening, a wave of canine panic spreading outward from the woods behind our house. I was about to wake the kids and make a dash for the house when something hit the roof of the tent. Not hard, but with enough weight to make the fabric sag slightly. Then another impact, and another. I reached up and felt the objects through the tent material, rocks. Someone or something was throwing rocks at our tent. I was frozen with indecision. Should I grab the kids and run for the house, potentially exposing us to whatever was out there? Or stay put, protected only by the flimsy nylon of the tent? Before I could decide, something larger landed on the tent with a soft thud and rolled off. A stick or small branch from the sound it made hitting the deck. Then came the strangest part of the whole encounter. From just outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away, came the sound of a cat meowing. But it wasn't right. It was close, but just off somehow. Like someone trying to imitate a cat without ever having owned one. It had the right general sound, but none of the natural variations a real cat would make. It was trying to lure us out, or at least that's how it felt. Trying to mimic my daughter's cat to get us to open the tent. The realization sent a wave of nausea through me. I stayed absolutely still, fighting the urge to call out or make any noise at all. The fake meowing continued for another minute or so, then stopped. The heavy breathing sound had ceased too, but I had the overwhelming sense that whatever was out there hadn't left. It was just waiting, watching the tent. I'm not sure how long I sat there, shotgun ready, listening to every tiny sound outside. Eventually, the distant howling stopped, and gradually the neighborhood dogs quieted too. The silence that followed was almost worse. Tense, expectant, like the whole world was holding its breath. I must have dozed off at some point despite my terror, because the next thing I knew, dawn light was filtering through the tent fabric and the kids were stirring. I quickly hid the shotgun in its case before they fully woke up, not wanting to frighten them. When we emerged from the tent, everything looked normal. The deck was empty except for a few small rocks and one stick about the size of my forearm. My daughter's cat was sitting on the porch railing, looking perfectly calm and ordinary. There were no obvious tracks in the yard, no clear evidence that anything unusual had happened. I might have convinced myself it was all some strange half-dream, a product of reading too many weird stories online, except for what happened later that day. Around noon, my son came running into the house, his face pale. He'd been playing at the edge of our property near the tree line, but still in full view of the house. He said he'd seen someone watching him from behind an old tree stump about 30 yards into the woods. When I asked him to describe what he'd seen, his description made my blood run cold. Really tall, with shoulders like a basketball player, he said, arms too long. And its face was weird, like its mouth was just a thin line, and its eyes were black holes. Not like regular eyes at all, and its skin looked grey, like someone who's really sick. He said it had been crouched behind the stump, just the top half of its body visible, staring at him. When he noticed it and froze, it slowly ducked down out of sight. I grabbed my shotgun and went to check, telling the kids to stay in the house with the doors locked. I searched the area thoroughly but found nothing conclusive, just some broken undergrowth, and what might have been a large impression in the soft ground behind the stump, already filling with water from the previous night's dew. That night, we slept in the house with all doors and windows locked, curtains drawn. I didn't sleep at all, sitting in the living room with the shotgun across my lap, jumping at every sound outside. Around 3 in the morning, the neighborhood dogs all started howling again simultaneously. It lasted for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Since then, I've been researching similar experiences online. I've found accounts of rocks being thrown, of strange howls and calls, of creatures that try to mimic familiar sounds to lure people out. Most of these stories come from remote areas, deep wilderness, isolated cabins, rural campsites, not suburban backyards like ours. But the details match too closely to be coincidence. The vocalizations, the rock throwing, the strange grey figure my son described, all of it fits with what some researchers call Sasquatch behavior, though I still have trouble even typing that word in association with what happened to us. I've installed motion-activated floodlights covering our entire yard. I've put up cameras. I've reinforced the locks on all our doors and windows. The kids haven't been allowed to play outside alone since that day. Every night when the sun goes down, I find myself listening, for whoops, for howls, for the sound of heavy footsteps approaching our house. Most nights are quiet now, but sometimes, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I'll hear a single rock hit the side of the house or the roof, just one, like a reminder that it's still out there, still watching. 2 nights ago, my daughter's cat refused to come inside at dusk. She sat on the deck railing, back arched, staring into the woods and making that same strange, alarmed sound she made that night in the tent. I had to go out and physically pick her up to bring her in. As I was turning to go back inside, I caught movement at the edge of the tree line, just a shadow shifting between two trunks. There and gone so quickly I can't be sure of what I saw. But I know what I heard that night on the deck. I know what was out there, watching us, testing us, communicating with others of its kind deeper in the woods. I know it's still out there, and I know it's only a matter of time before it comes back. Story 11. The day I became insignificant. I've been hesitating to share this experience for years, but after reading similar encounters online, I think it's time I get this off my chest. What happened to me in the Shenandoah Valley back when I was 17 has haunted me for over 2 decades now. Growing up in Augusta County, Virginia, the woods were basically my second home. My grandfather taught me to hunt from the time I could safely hold a rifle, and I knew those forests like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The valley has a special kind of beauty to it, with rolling mountains hugging both sides, lush forests, and abundant wildlife. By my teens, I'd tracked and hunted deer, turkey, and small game through every season. But there was one incident when I was 14 that should have been my first warning. My grandfather and I were out with his hunting dogs, 3 blue-tick hounds that were the best trackers in the county. We were following a promising deer trail when suddenly all 3 dogs just changed. It happened in an instant. Their behavior shifted from excited tracking to absolute terror. Their hackles shot up, they pulled back against their leads and started making this low, throaty growl I'd never heard from them before. They were staring intently into a dense thicket about 30 yards off the trail. My grandfather, who'd been teaching me to read animal sign, just froze. I started to ask what was wrong, but he cut me off with a quick shake of his head. Without a word, he gathered us all up and we left. Just turned right around and walked straight back to the truck. He never explained what happened, and when I asked about it later, he just changed the subject. Fast forward 3 years. I was 17, it was opening day of deer season, and I was finally old enough to hunt on my own. I'd gotten my own pair of hounds by then, young dogs, but well trained. I decided to take them out to an area my grandfather had shown me a few years earlier, accessed by an old logging road that wasn't on most maps. It was about 2 hours before sunset, perfect hunting time. The forest was doing that thing where the light filters through the leaves in shafts, and everything's quiet except for the occasional bird call. My dogs were working a promising scent, not fully on a trail yet, but definitely interested in something. I was walking along this old road, really just 2 dirt tracks with grass growing in the middle, when I got this weird feeling. You know how sometimes you just sense someone watching you? It was like that, but stronger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself checking over my shoulder every few steps. After about the 3rd time looking back and seeing nothing, I realized something odd. Every time I took a step, there was an echo, like someone behind me was matching my pace exactly, step for step. I'd stop, and a split second later, the steps behind me would stop too. I'd start walking again, and so would they. My first thought was, it might be a lynx. They've been known to stalk hunters, curious about the commotion. I decided to scare it off, so I spun around quickly, expecting to see a startled wildcat dart into the undergrowth. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. About 20 yards behind me on the old road was what I initially registered as a bear. But even in that first split second, my brain was already rejecting that classification. The shape was wrong. The posture was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. It was partially obscured behind a large poplar tree, but I could see enough to know this was no ordinary animal. It was dark, furry, and massive, but standing in a way no bear would stand. I could see a shoulder and part of an arm. Yes, an arm, not a foreleg, gripping the side of the tree. Pure instinct took over. I unslung my rifle and jacked around into the chamber, intending to fire a warning shot into the air. The metallic sound of the action echoed through the trees. That's when it moved. From behind that poplar stepped a creature that defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was enormous, at least 7 feet tall, with shoulders that must have been 40 inches across. It was covered in dark brown fur, walking fully upright on 2 legs with a smooth, rolling gait that no human could mimic. And it just walked past me. That's the part that still shakes me to my core. This massive, impossible creature emerged from behind the tree and walked right by me on my right side, no more than 15 feet away, as if I weren't even there. As if I were completely insignificant. It didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me in any way, just strode past with purpose, heading deeper into the forest. My dogs, who had been ranging ahead, suddenly became aware of what was happening. They turned and charged toward the creature, barking and snarling. In that moment, I snapped out of my shock paralysis and started running. Not toward the thing like my brave but foolish dogs, but back toward my truck parked about a quarter-mile down the road. I was halfway there when I heard it, a roar that seemed to shake the entire forest. It wasn't like a bear's roar or any sound I'd ever heard in those woods. It was deeper, more powerful, with a quality to it that felt almost intelligent in its rage. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing off the mountains, making it impossible to tell exactly where it had come from. Seconds later, my dogs came tearing past me, no longer brave hunters, but terrified animals. When I reached my truck, they were already there, actually hiding underneath the vehicle, trembling so hard I could see dust shaking off their coats. I threw my rifle in the cab, coaxed the dogs into the back, and got out of there as fast as the rutted old road would allow. The entire drive home, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that massive form emerge from the tree line behind me. When I got home, my grandfather took one look at my face and the state of my dogs and seemed to understand immediately. He sat me down at the kitchen table, poured me a cup of coffee, the first time he'd ever treated me like an adult, and asked what happened. I told him everything, my voice shaking at points, expecting him to think I was either lying or had lost my mind. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his weathered face grim. When I finished my story, all he said was, "Don't go back to those woods." 7 simple words, but the way he said them, with absolute seriousness and what I now recognize was fear, told me he knew exactly what I'd encountered. I pressed him for more, but he shook his head and walked out to the porch. That was it. We never discussed it again. But from that day forward, he never hunted in that part of the valley again. Neither did I. What haunts me most about the encounter isn't the creature's size or the inhuman roar that followed. It's the way it simply ignored me. I was standing there with a loaded rifle, enough firepower to bring down a large buck, and it didn't even acknowledge my existence. It made a conscious decision that I wasn't worth its attention. In that moment, I understood something profound about my place in the natural world. I wasn't the apex predator I'd been raised to believe I was. I wasn't even a threat. I was merely an observer, tolerated as long as I kept my distance, insignificant in the larger scheme of things. I've told this story a handful of times over the years. Most people think I saw a bear in poor lighting, and my teenage imagination filled in the rest. Some suggest it was a man in a ghillie suit, though why anyone would be wandering those remote woods in such a costume, or how they could appear so massive, is never adequately explained. Only other hunters sometimes nod quietly, then share their own stories of strange encounters in remote places, unusual sounds, inexplicable tracks, moments when the forest goes unnaturally silent, and that feeling of being watched by something intelligent. I still hunt, but never alone, and never in that part of the Shenandoah Valley. I'm careful about where I go, especially around dusk. I pay attention when my dogs act strangely. I respect the boundaries that were made clear to me that day, because the most terrifying revelation wasn't that these creatures exist. It's that they've always been there, watching from the edges of our awareness, choosing when to remain hidden and when to reveal themselves. They know the forests better than we ever will. They understand our behaviors, our movements, our weaknesses, and they decide, moment by moment, whether to remain shadows or to step into the light. That day, one of them decided to show itself to me, not out of aggression or fear, but perhaps as a reminder. These aren't their woods we're visiting. They're our woods they're allowing us to use. I've spent years researching similar encounters since then, reading accounts from across the Appalachian Range and beyond. The descriptions vary in details, but certain elements remain consistent. The height, the purposeful gait, the intelligence behind their actions. What some call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, others refer to as wild men or forest giants. Native American traditions speak of them as another tribe, not quite human but far more than animal. Whatever they are, they're real, and they've been watching us far longer than we've been watching for them. A few years after my encounter, I was helping my grandfather clean out his hunting cabin when I found an old journal tucked behind a loose board in the wall. Inside were detailed accounts of similar sightings dating back to the 1930s, not just his experiences, but those of his father and grandfather before him. 3 generations of my family had encountered these creatures in those same woods, each choosing to keep their experiences private, sharing them only through these hidden records. The final entry, dated just a week before my own encounter, contained a map with certain areas marked in red, areas to avoid. The spot where I'd seen my creature was circled heavily with a single note beside it. "They're getting bolder." I sometimes wonder if my grandfather knew what would happen that day, if he somehow suspected I needed to have my own encounter to truly understand. Or perhaps he thought the stories in the journal would be dismissed as an old man's fantasies, while a direct experience would leave no room for doubt. Either way, he was right. Once you've stood face to face with something that science says doesn't exist, something that moves through the world with such confidence and power, you can never go back to not knowing. The world becomes simultaneously larger and more mysterious, filled with possibilities both wondrous and terrifying. I still have that journal, along with my own detailed account of what happened that day. I've added to it over the years, noting patterns in sightings, changes in territory, behaviors that seem significant. I don't know if my children will ever read it, or if I'll pass it down as my grandfather did, hidden away, a secret record of a truth too strange for casual sharing. What I do know is that something significant happened to me that day in the woods of Augusta County, something that changed how I understand my place in the natural world, something that taught me that being human, with all our technology, our weapons, our supposed dominance, doesn't make us untouchable or even particularly important in the grand scheme of things. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods at dusk and the light filters through the trees just so, I'll catch myself listening for footsteps matching my own, looking over my shoulder at nothing. And I'll remember the moment when that massive form walked past me without a glance. The ultimate dismissal from a creature that had assessed me and found me unworthy of concern. In that moment, I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was just another animal in the woods, permitted to exist alongside something older and more powerful than I could comprehend, something that had been there long before me and would remain long after I'm gone. And in a strange way, there was a kind of freedom in that insignificance, in knowing that some mysteries remain beyond our understanding, some creatures beyond our control. The world is wilder and more wondrous than we allow ourselves to believe, but it's also a reminder to tread carefully in places we don't fully understand, to listen when the forest goes quiet, to respect boundaries we might not even know exist until we've already crossed them. Because sometimes, if you're very unlucky or perhaps very lucky, you might find yourself face to face with something impossible. And in that moment, all your preconceptions about your place in the world will shatter, leaving you with a truth both humbling and profound. We are not alone, and we are not in charge. We never have been. Story 12. At the thing in the soybean field. I've been sitting on this story for over 40 years now. Back in 1980, I was just a regular teenager in southern Wisconsin, riding my bike along the country roads that cut through endless fields of corn and soybeans. It was the kind of rural area where you could ride for miles without seeing another person. Just farmland stretching to the horizon in all directions. I never gave much thought to what might be out there besides farmers and wildlife. That changed on a summer afternoon that I still can't explain away, no matter how hard I've tried. It was late July, one of those muggy Midwest summer days where the air feels like a wet blanket. I was 14, riding my beat-up Schwinn along the gravel road that ran past Old Man Weber's soybean fields. The crops were about 3 feet high by then, lush and green, stretching out like a dense carpet on both sides of the road. I was about 2 miles from home when I noticed something odd in Weber's field to my right. At first, I thought it was just the wind making the soybeans sway, but there was barely a breeze that day. As I slowed my bike, I realized something was moving through the field, something big enough to part the plants as it went. My first thought was maybe Weber had let his dog out, or maybe it was a deer browsing through the crops. I stopped my bike completely, balancing with one foot on the gravel, and that's when I saw it. Something I still struggle to describe all these years later. Whatever it wasn't a dog or a deer. It was tall, standing fully upright in the soybean field. The plants came up to about mid-thigh on it, which meant it had to be at least 6.5 to 7 feet tall. And the way it moved was just wrong. It was jumping, not running, not walking, but actually jumping over the rows of soybeans. Each jump carried it about 4 or 5 feet, completely clearing the plants in a way that seemed effortless, almost like it was bouncing on springs. The movements were smooth, fluid, not at all like the awkward leaps a human would make. From my distance, I'd guess it was about 60 to 70 yards away, I could make out a bulky form covered in what looked like chocolate brown hair or fur. It wasn't thin like a person wearing a costume. This thing had mass to it, probably 350 to 400 pounds of solid weight. The proportions were human-like in the basic sense, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but everything was just slightly off, like looking at a human shape that had been stretched and bulked up in all the wrong places. I remember thinking someone must be playing a prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Whatever this was, it was moving with too much natural grace, too much power to be a person in a suit. And who would be out in the middle of a soybean field in the blistering heat wearing a fur costume anyway? I must have made some noise or movement that caught its attention, because suddenly it stopped jumping and turned toward the road. Even from that distance, I could see that its face wasn't covered in the same brown fur as the rest of its body. The face was dark, almost coal black, with heavy brow ridges that shadowed its eyes. The nose was broad and flat, not protruding like a human nose. I couldn't make out detailed facial features at that distance, but the contrast between the dark face and the brown fur was unmistakable. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the field. I was frozen on my bike, unable to move, barely breathing. Then it started walking, not jumping anymore, but taking deliberate, heavy steps straight toward the road, toward me. That broke my paralysis. I don't remember consciously deciding to flee. My body just reacted. I jammed my feet onto the pedals and took off down the gravel road as fast as I could push that old Schwinn. The rocks crunched loudly under my tires, and my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't look back until I'd gone at least a quarter mile. When I finally did, there was nothing visible above the soybean plants. Whatever it was had either dropped down out of sight or had gone back the way it came. I didn't stop to investigate. I rode all the way home without pausing, threw my bike down in the yard and ran inside. I didn't tell my parents. What would I say? That I saw a monster in Weber's soybean field? That some giant hairy thing was jumping around like it was on a trampoline? They'd think I was making it up, or that the heat had gotten to me, so I kept it to myself, tried to convince myself it was just a strange trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But I knew what I'd seen. And the image of that thing turning to look at me, then deliberately walking toward the road, has stayed with me all these years. That was my first encounter, but not my last. Years later, in the summer of 1989, I was in my early 20s and had moved on with my life. I'd mostly managed to file away the soybean field incident as one of those unexplainable childhood memories. I was working construction jobs around the state, and one weekend, a buddy and I decided to drive up to Lake Superior to check out a waterfall near Cornucopia, Wisconsin. It was a remote area, heavily wooded, with narrow hiking trails leading to several small but scenic waterfalls. We'd parked at a small gravel lot and were hiking in, maybe a half-mile from the car, when I was hit with the most overwhelming stench I've ever experienced in my life. It wasn't just bad, it was physically assaulting. Imagine the worst skunk spray you've ever smelled, combined with the musk of a male weasel during mating season, topped off with the sickly sweet odor of rotting meat. It was so powerful that it made my eyes water instantly and caused this burning sensation in the back of my throat. I actually gagged and had to stop walking. My buddy smelled it too and covered his nose with his shirt. "What the hell is that?" he asked, his voice muffled through the fabric. "Dead animal." Dead. But this wasn't like any dead animal I'd ever smelled, and I'd come across plenty while hunting and fishing over the years. This was different, more complex, and somehow more deliberate. That's the only word I can think of to describe it. Like the smell wasn't just happening, it was being projected. And then I noticed something else that sent a chill down my spine despite the summer heat. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing, nothing. Just absolute complete silence, as if someone had suddenly muted the entire woodland. That's when I knew. I didn't see anything this time, but I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I'd encountered in that soybean field 9 years earlier was somewhere nearby, watching us from the dense undergrowth. My buddy was still complaining about the smell, but I grabbed his arm and said, "We need to go. Now." Something in my voice must have conveyed the urgency I felt, because he didn't argue. We turned around and started walking quickly back toward the parking lot. The smell followed us for about 100 yards, then gradually faded. My throat continued to burn for 15 to 20 minutes afterward, like I'd inhaled some kind of mild chemical irritant. When we got back to the car, I insisted on leaving immediately, even though we hadn't seen the waterfall we'd come for. On the drive back, my buddy asked what had spooked me so badly. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the full story, so I just mumbled something about bears being known to attack when you smell that kind of odor. He seemed skeptical, but dropped it. The two experiences 9 years apart have left me with questions I'll probably never get answers to. What was that thing in the soybean field? Was it the same creature I sensed but didn't see in the woods near Cornucopia? Are there more of them out there? I've read accounts online from people who've had similar encounters. Some call what they saw Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others use regional names like Wendigo or simply the hairy man. The descriptions vary, but certain details are consistent. The height, the strength, the way they move with a fluid grace that seems impossible for their size. And that smell, that terrible, overwhelming odor that seems to announce their presence when they want it known. The part that still haunts me most about the soybean field encounter was the duality of it. On one hand, there was something almost playful about the way it was jumping through the field, like a child hopping through puddles. But when it turned and saw me, when it started deliberately walking toward the road with those heavy, purposeful steps, that was something else entirely. It wasn't just curiosity. There was intent there, a focused awareness that made me feel like prey being sized up by a predator. And the second encounter, though I saw nothing, was in some ways more terrifying because it felt like a warning. That smell wasn't just a natural body odor. It was too strong, too sudden, too complete in how it saturated the area. It was like a defense mechanism, a way of saying, this is my territory and you are not welcome here. I've tried to explain both incidents in rational terms. Maybe what I saw as a teenager was just a very tall man wearing dark clothes, walking through the field. Maybe the smell in the woods was just a combination of dead animals and swamp gas. Maybe the silence was just a coincidence, a moment when all the wildlife happened to go quiet at once. But I don't believe that. Not really. I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. There are things in this world that we haven't catalogued, haven't explained, haven't accepted into our narrow definition of what's possible. Things that move through remote places, mostly avoiding human contact, but occasionally allowing themselves to be glimpsed or sensed. I'm in my 50s now, with a family and a normal life in a suburban neighborhood, far from soybean fields and northern forests. I don't go hiking much anymore, and when I do, I stick to populated trails in state parks. I tell myself it's because I'm older now, less adventurous, more comfortable with the predictable rhythms of everyday life. But that's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I'm afraid of having a third encounter. Afraid of what might happen if one of these creatures decided not to walk toward me, but to run. Afraid of finding out what comes after the warning smell if the warning is ignored. Sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas and past fields of crops or patches of dense woodland, I find myself scanning the edges, looking for movement, for something tall standing where it shouldn't be. My wife has noticed, asking why I always slow down near certain types of terrain. I just tell her I'm watching for deer crossing the road. I don't know if I'll ever understand what I experienced all those years ago, but I know it was real. And I know there are spaces in this world where humans are not the dominant species, where we are the intruders, the unwelcome visitors who would be wise to pass through quickly and quietly without drawing attention to ourselves. Because sometimes, attention is exactly what you don't want to attract. Last week, I was in the basement going through some old boxes when I found a newspaper clipping I'd saved from 1981. It was a small article from a local paper about strange tracks found in a field near where I'd had my first encounter. The farmer, not Weber, but a property a few miles away, had discovered a series of unusual depressions in his field, spaced about 6 feet apart, as if something heavy had been jumping through the crops. The article quoted a local wildlife expert saying it was probably just deer damage, but the farmer insisted no deer could make tracks like that. I sat there in my basement, holding that yellowed piece of newsprint, and felt that same cold knot in my stomach that I'd felt on that summer day 40 years ago, because I knew those tracks weren't made by deer. They were made by something that could clear 3-foot soybean plants in a single bound. Something that walked on 2 legs but moved like nothing human. Something that, for reasons I'll never understand, decided to let me see it that day, and then to let me go. Story 13. Number sign, the observer on the slope. I've debated sharing this for years, but after reading similar experiences online, I think it's time. What happened that autumn day in 2012 changed how I view the woods around my home forever. I still get chills thinking about it, especially knowing that whatever I saw might have been watching my family for decades without us realizing it. It was a perfect fall day, mid-October, clear blue sky, temperatures in the low 60s. I'd been looking forward to this day all week. I had a pork shoulder and 2 racks of ribs ready for the smoker. Anyone who's into barbecuing knows there's something almost meditative about tending a smoker all day, and I was in my element. I got everything set up on our back deck around 8 in the morning. The smoke was already billowing nicely, carrying that sweet hickory scent across our yard. Our house sits on a small hill with a wooded slope facing us. Nothing massive, maybe 3 acres of trees that gradually descend to a small creek at the bottom. I've lived here for 17 years, so I know every tree, every rock, every feature of that little patch of woods, or at least I thought I did. Around 11, I was checking the temperature on the smoker when something caught my eye on the hillside across our yard. About halfway down the slope, there was a dark shape that seemed out of place. At first, I assumed it was just a shadow or maybe a patch of vegetation I hadn't noticed before, but something about it didn't look right. I kept glancing over while adjusting the vents on the smoker, and what struck me as odd was that the shape didn't move at all, not even slightly, despite the occasional breeze rustling the surrounding trees. If it was an animal, a bear maybe, though we rarely get them in our area, it would have shifted position at some point. For almost an hour, I kept an eye on this dark mass while going about my barbecue routine. It was large, maybe the size of a refrigerator if it was laying on its side, and significantly darker than anything else on the slope. The longer I watched, the more convinced I became that this wasn't something that belonged there. Eventually, I called my wife Kim out to the deck. "Look at that dark spot on the hillside," I said, pointing. "Has that always been there?" She squinted, shielding her eyes from the sun. "What is that? A fallen tree?" "That's what I thought at first, but I don't remember seeing it before, and I was just down there clearing some brush last weekend." We both stood there, staring at this anomaly on our familiar slope. After a few minutes, Kim went back inside, but I couldn't stop looking. Something about it just felt wrong, like when you walk into a room and immediately sense someone has been there, even though nothing is visibly disturbed. By early afternoon, I'd convinced myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just a shadow cast by the trees, or maybe a large piece of bark that had fallen from one of the older oaks. The only way to satisfy my curiosity was to go check it out. I turned the smoker down to a steady temperature that wouldn't need monitoring for a while, and headed across the yard toward the slope. Our property isn't huge, maybe 100 yards from the deck to the tree line, then another 50 or 60 yards down the wooded slope to where I'd spotted the dark mass. As I crossed the yard, I kept my eyes fixed on that spot. Still no movement. No sound other than the normal bird calls and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Everything seemed perfectly normal, which somehow made the whole situation even more unsettling. I reached the edge of the woods and started making my way down the slope, navigating around familiar trees and over roots I'd stepped over hundreds of times before. The closer I got to where I'd seen the dark shape, the more my heart rate picked up. I wasn't scared exactly, more like intensely alert, the way you feel when you sense something isn't quite right but can't put your finger on why. When I was about 60 feet away, I finally got a clear view of what I'd been staring at all morning. It wasn't a fallen tree, it wasn't a shadow, it was something I still struggle to classify. The best I can describe it is that it looked like a large, dark figure crouched or hunched over. In the split second that I registered what I was seeing, it moved. Not gradually, not with any hesitation, but in one fluid motion. It stood up. What had appeared to be a dark mass on the forest floor unfolded into a towering figure, easily 7 to 8 feet tall. It rose with a smoothness that didn't seem possible for something that size, like watching time-lapse footage of a plant growing, except this happened in under 2 seconds. I froze. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest, as this impossible figure stood fully upright about 60 feet away from me. I couldn't make out clear details. It was backlit by the afternoon sun, filtering through the trees behind it, but the silhouette was unmistakably humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head set on broad shoulders. But the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad, the arms hanging too low. For a moment that felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, we just stayed there, me frozen in shock, it standing perfectly still as if assessing me. Then, without any warning, it turned and moved up the slope away from me. The way it moved is something I'll never forget. It didn't crash through the underbrush like a person would. It seemed to glide between the trees, covering ground with long, purposeful strides that carried it up the hill far faster than any human could move on that terrain. Within seconds, it had disappeared over the crest of the hill. I stood there for several minutes, unable to process what I'd just seen. My mind kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear that had been sitting and then stood on its hind legs. But bears don't move like that. Maybe it was another hiker who had wandered onto my property. But no person could be that tall or move that fluidly through dense woods. Eventually, I backed away slowly, then turned and made my way back to the house as quickly as I could without running. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure following me, but the woods remained still and empty. When I got back to the deck, Kim took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. I was pale, sweating, my hands visibly shaking as I checked the smoker on autopilot. "What happened?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I told her what I'd seen, trying to be as factual as possible even though my voice kept catching. I expected disbelief or even laughter. It sounded crazy even as I was saying it. But instead, she went quiet, her expression shifting from concern to something like recognition. "My mom saw something like that," she finally said. "Back in the 70s, when I was little." This was the first I'd ever heard of this. Kim explained that when she was about 2 years old, her mother had been watching her play in a small playpen they kept in the yard of their old house, which, I realized with a chill, was less than a mile from where we live now. Her mother had gone inside briefly to answer the phone, and when she came back out, she saw what she described as an enormous figure standing next to the tree closest to Kim's playpen. Their little dog Peaches started howling frantically. Kim's mother screamed, and the figure immediately ran for the trees at the edge of their property. For years, Kim's mother had refused to talk about exactly what she'd seen, just saying it was probably some weirdo who had wandered onto their property. It wasn't until years later, when Kim was an adult, that her mother admitted the man had been far too large to be human, with strange proportions and movements that still haunted her dreams decades later. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, mechanically tending to the smoker while constantly scanning the tree line. The food came out fine. Smoking is so ingrained in my routine that I could probably do it in my sleep, but I barely tasted it when we sat down to eat. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of it. What had I actually seen? Why had it been sitting there completely motionless for so long? Had it been watching our house, watching me? And the most disturbing question of all, if Kim's mother had seen something similar decades ago in nearly the same location, was it possible this thing, whatever it was, had been in these woods all along? Had it been observing our family, our neighborhood, for generations? In the days that followed, I researched similar encounters online. I found hundreds of accounts from people who described seeing large humanoid figures in wooded areas across North America. Some called them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others just referred to them as the Watchers or forest people. The descriptions varied, but certain elements remained consistent: the height, the fluid movement, the sense of being observed rather than threatened. One detail that kept coming up in these accounts was the way these creatures would sometimes remain completely motionless for hours, blending in with their surroundings so effectively that they were nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Some researchers suggested this was a hunting technique, while others believed it was a form of surveillance, a way of observing humans without being noticed. The thought that this thing might have been sitting there watching our house, watching me cook on the deck for who knows how long before I happened to notice it, still makes my skin crawl. How many other times had it been there observing us while we remained completely unaware? I've installed motion sensor lights around our property since then. I've even set up trail cameras facing the slope, though they've never captured anything unusual. But sometimes, especially in the fall, when I'm out on the deck with the smoker going, I get that feeling again. That prickling awareness of being watched from the trees. The most unsettling theory I've come across is that these creatures are drawn to certain stimuli, including the smell of cooking food. Some researchers believe they're particularly attracted to smoked meat, which might explain why it showed up on that specific day, while I had the smoker going for hours. If that's true, then maybe what I experienced wasn't a random encounter. Maybe the smell of that pork shoulder and ribs smoking all day lured it out of hiding, drew it close enough that I finally noticed what had perhaps been there all along. I still use my smoker. I still go into those woods occasionally, always in daylight, always with a healthy awareness of my surroundings. But I never again venture down to that particular spot on the slope where I saw the figure stand up. Something about that specific location feels marked somehow, as if it serves as a boundary between two worlds that normally don't intersect. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching from just beyond the tree line, waiting for the next time I fire up the smoker. Waiting for another opportunity to observe us from what it considers a safe distance. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right and carries the scent of hickory smoke into the woods, I swear I can feel eyes on me again. Patient, curious, ancient eyes that have been watching my family far longer than I've been watching the woods. Last weekend, I was out on the deck preparing the smoker for a brisket. It was early morning, the sun just starting to burn off the mist that had settled in the low areas overnight. As I was setting up, I happened to glance toward the slope and saw something that made my blood run cold. In almost exactly the same spot where I'd seen the figure 5 years ago, there was a dark shape against the forest floor. I stared at it for nearly a minute, my heart pounding, before realizing it was just a fallen branch that hadn't been there before. At least, that's what I told myself. But as I turned away to continue with my preparations, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd encountered that autumn day wasn't finished with us yet, that maybe it never would be. Story 14. The moment I realized we're not alone. I've never told this story publicly before. It's been 37 years since that morning in Wayne National Forest, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My name's Jeff, and I live in the southern tip of Ohio. I've been a hunter all my life. Grew up tracking deer through these woods, learning every trail and creek crossing. But what I saw in the fall of 1986 changed everything I thought I knew about these forests. It was early November, prime deer season. I'd set up my tree stand a week earlier in a promising spot in Gallia County, deep in Wayne National Forest. If you've never been there, it's a massive stretch of wilderness, over 250,000 acres of dense forest, steep ravines and winding creeks, perfect deer habitat, and remote enough that you can go days without seeing another human. That morning I woke up at 3:30, gathered my gear, and drove out to my hunting spot. It was cold, maybe mid-30s, with a heavy mist hanging in the air, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones. I hiked in about a mile from the nearest forest service road, using just my small, red-filtered flashlight to find my way along the familiar path. My tree stand was set up about 18 feet high in a mature oak, overlooking a small pond where deer often came to drink in the early morning. I climbed up in the pitch darkness, secured my safety harness, and settled in for the wait. Any hunter will tell you that patience is everything. I had my thermos of coffee, some beef jerky, and hours of stillness ahead of me. As the first hints of grey appeared in the eastern sky, the forest around me began to wake up. I could hear a few early birds, the occasional rustle of small animals in the leaf litter below. The mist was still thick, making everything look ghostly and indistinct. Visibility was maybe 30 yards at best, just enough to see the edge of the small pond below my position. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere in the mist. At first, I thought it might be bees, which made no sense given the cold temperature. It was almost like humming or singing, but not quite like any animal sound I'd ever heard. Low, melodic, with a strange resonance that seemed to vibrate in my chest more than my ears. I froze in place, my coffee forgotten in my hand. Whatever was making that sound was moving closer, the noise gradually becoming more distinct. Through the swirling mist, I caught movement. Something large approaching the pond from the opposite side, maybe 40 yards away. My first thought was bear. We don't have many black bears in southern Ohio, but they're not unheard of, especially in Wayne National. The shape was right. Large, dark, hulking. But as it emerged more clearly from the mist, I realized something was very wrong with that assessment. This thing was walking completely upright, on two legs. Not in the awkward way a bear might stand up momentarily, but naturally, fluidly, like a person would walk. Except no person is that big. It had to be at least 6 to 7 feet tall, with a bulk and mass that made it look impossibly solid against the ethereal backdrop of the morning mist. As it got closer to the pond's edge, I could see it was carrying something. Cradled in its arms was what appeared to be a smaller version of itself. A baby. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just some unknown creature. It was a mother with her child. The humming sound I'd been hearing was coming from her. She was making this soft, melodic vocalization as she looked down at the infant in her arms. It wasn't human singing, but it wasn't animal either. Something in between, with patterns and intentionality that spoke of intelligence and emotion. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My hands gripped my rifle so tightly my knuckles were white. But the thought of raising it never even crossed my mind. I just sat there, frozen in my tree stand, watching this impossible scene unfold below me. She walked to the edge of the pond, completely unaware of my presence above and behind her. The mist was thinning now, and I could see her more clearly. She was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair or fur, not shaggy like a bear's, but not as smooth as a human's hair either. Her proportions were human-like but exaggerated. Broader shoulders, longer arms, a more conical head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. What happened next is burned into my memory with perfect clarity. She knelt down at the pond's edge and dipped her free hand into the water. With surprising gentleness for something so massive, she brought the water up and used it to clean the baby's face. The little one squirmed slightly, and she made a different sound, softer, almost like cooing. She repeated this several times, carefully washing the infant, who couldn't have been more than a fraction of her size, maybe like a human 6-month-old in proportion. Between rinses, she would look down at the baby's face with what I can only describe as tenderness. Continuing that soft humming sound, I was witnessing something profoundly intimate, a mother caring for her child. But this mother wasn't human. She wasn't any known animal. She was something science said couldn't exist. Yet here she was, not 30 yards from me, engaged in one of the most basic acts of parenting. After a few minutes of this, she stood up again. The baby seemed to curl closer against her chest, and she adjusted her hold, supporting its head with a gesture so recognizably maternal it made my throat tight. Then, without any hurry, she turned and walked away from the pond, heading into a particularly dense thicket of young trees and brush. What struck me was how effortlessly she moved through that undergrowth. Anyone who's tried to push through a balsam thicket knows it's like fighting your way through a natural barbed wire fence. but she glided through it without breaking stride, without making the crashing sounds a human would make. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone, the thick vegetation swallowing her completely. The humming sound faded with her until the forest was silent again, except for the normal morning birds beginning their chorus. I sat there for I don't know how long, maybe minutes, maybe an hour. I couldn't move. My heart was hammering so hard, I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, but it wasn't exactly fear I was feeling, or at least not the kind of fear you'd expect when encountering a massive unknown creature in the wilderness. What I felt was more complex: awe, disbelief, and yes, terror, but not of being attacked. What terrified me was the vulnerability of my position. I was strapped into a tree stand 18 feet up a tree. If she had noticed me, if she had perceived me as a threat to her baby, I would have had nowhere to go, no quick escape route, just me trapped on my perch, at the mercy of a creature that could probably tear the tree down if it wanted to. And beyond that immediate concern was the larger existential shock. I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that countless scientific authorities had dismissed as folklore and hoaxes. Yet I had just watched it engage in one of the most fundamentally human behaviors possible, caring for its young with evident love and attention. When I finally managed to move again, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my thermos. I quietly packed up my gear, unhooked my safety harness, and climbed down as silently as I could. The entire hike back to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the forest around me with new eyes. The familiar woods suddenly seemed alien, filled with possibilities and presences I'd never considered before. I didn't hunt for the rest of that season. Couldn't bring myself to go back into those woods. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like respect. I felt like I'd been granted a glimpse of something few people ever see, something private and precious. To go back there with a weapon, even if I had no intention of using it on her kind, felt wrong somehow. Over the years, I've done a lot of research on Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings. Most focus on fleeting glimpses, strange footprints, or scary encounters. Very few mention the family dynamics or behaviors I witnessed. But those that do describe similar scenes, mothers with infants, careful grooming behaviors, even that same humming or singing sound. I've thought a lot about why she didn't notice me that morning. The mist probably helped obscure me, and the fact that I was downwind meant she couldn't smell me. But I think there was something else too. She was completely absorbed in caring for her baby. Any parent knows that feeling, that tunnel vision, when you're tending to your child. In that moment, despite our profound differences, I recognized something fundamentally similar between her experience and human experience. What's strangest to me, looking back, is how that one morning completely reshaped my understanding of the natural world. Before, I was a pretty conventional guy. I believed what science told me, scoffed at cryptid stories, thought people who claimed to see Bigfoot were either lying or confused. After that morning, I had to reconstruct my entire worldview. If these creatures exist, intelligent, family-oriented beings sharing our forests, what else might be out there that we've dismissed as myth or misidentification? How much don't we know about the world we think we've completely catalogued and understood? I started hunting again eventually, but differently, more respectfully, more aware that I'm not necessarily at the top of the food chain, more conscious that I might be being watched even when I think I'm alone. I still use that same tree stand sometimes, though I've moved it to a different area. And every time I climb up before dawn and wait for the light to filter through the trees, I find myself listening for that distinctive humming sound. I've never seen her again, or any others like her. But I've had moments, strange sounds in the distance, unusual patterns of broken branches, a feeling of being watched when I'm deep in the back country. Once, I found what looked like a crude shelter of bent saplings far from any trail. Another time, I came across a series of 3 trees that had been twisted together in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. little signs, little reminders that we share these forests with something intelligent, something careful, something that mostly wants to be left alone. I've told this story to exactly 3 people before today. My wife, who believes me without question. My oldest friend, who thinks I dozed off in my tree stand and dreamed the whole thing. And my father, shortly before he died. His response has stayed with me all these years. He just nodded slowly and said, "The woods are deeper than we know, son. They are indeed. Deeper and more mysterious and more populated than most of us ever realize." I count myself lucky to have had that brief window into a world that runs parallel to ours, largely unseen, but undeniably there. A world where mothers hum to their babies at dawn beside misty ponds, where massive beings move silently through impenetrable thickets, where intelligence and tenderness exist in forms we've barely begun to understand. I still live in southern Ohio, still hunt these forests, still find myself scanning the edges of ponds and clearings at dawn, hoping for another glimpse. Not out of any desire to prove anything to the world. I've never gone public with my story before now, never sought validation or fame, but because once you've seen behind the veil, once you've witnessed something so profoundly unexpected, yet so recognizably emotional, you can't help but want to see it again, just to remind yourself that wonder still exists in this world, that mystery remains, that we don't know everything, and that sometimes, if you're very quiet and very lucky, the extraordinary reveals itself in the most ordinary of moments. A mother caring for her child in the soft light of dawn, humming a song no human has ever written. Story 15. The warning signs I should have heeded. I've spent 20 years in the army. I've been in combat zones. I've faced real danger and felt real fear. But nothing in my military career prepared me for what's been happening around our property in LaGrangeville, New York, over the past few years. I'm sharing this now because I need to make sense of it, and maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. It started in October of 2017. My buddy and I were fishing on the Batenkill River, a beautiful stretch of water that runs along the New York-Vermont border. It was a perfect fall day, leaves changing color, crisp air, the water running clear and cold. We'd been out for about 3 hours in my small John boat, catching a few nice trout, nothing exciting. We were drifting along a section where the river runs next to a steep, heavily wooded embankment, maybe 30 feet high and covered with dense trees and undergrowth. I remember noticing how quiet it had gotten. The birds had stopped singing, and even the constant background noise of the river seemed muted somehow. That's when it happened. Without any warning, a rock, and I'm not talking about a pebble here, this thing was the size of a cantaloupe, came flying from the top of the embankment. It hit the water about 3 feet from our boat, sent up a huge splash, then sank. The impact was so violent that water sprayed across us, and the boat actually rocked from the wave it created. My first thought was kids. You know, teenagers messing around, throwing rocks at fishermen for laughs. I stood up in the boat, scanning the top of the embankment, ready to yell at whoever had thrown it. But there was nobody visible up there, just trees and brush, no movement, no sounds of someone running away, nothing. "What the hell was that?" my buddy asked, wiping water from his face. Before I could answer, we heard it. A long, drawn-out sound from the same area where the rock had come from. It wasn't quite a roar, not exactly a growl, something in between that seemed to vibrate the air around us. It started loud, then tapered off, like whatever made it was moving away from the edge. We looked at each other, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. That wasn't a sound either of us recognized. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It wasn't any animal native to upstate New York that I'm familiar with. Without discussing it, I started the outboard motor, and we left. Fast. The entire way back to the launch site, I kept looking over my shoulder at that embankment, half expecting to see something watching us, but there was nothing visible. I tried to rationalize it afterward. Maybe it was just some weird echo that made the sound seem stranger than it was. Maybe the rock was loosened naturally and just happened to fall when we were passing by. But deep down, I knew better. That rock had been thrown, deliberately aimed to land near our boat, and that sound wasn't anything I could explain away. I mostly forgot about the incident until 2020, when things started happening around our home in Lagrangeville. It began with a smell. One evening in early fall, I stepped outside and caught a whiff of something that initially made me think our septic system had backed up. But this was different, more complex and far more offensive than sewage. It's hard to describe, but imagine the worst skunk spray you've ever smelled, combined with the musky odor of a male weasel in breeding season, topped off with the sweet putrid scent of rotting meat. It was so strong it made my eyes water and left this burning sensation in the back of my throat like I'd inhaled some mild chemical irritant. I started checking around the property, thinking maybe an animal had died somewhere nearby. The smell seemed strongest near the edge of our property, where it meets the woods, a fairly dense patch of forest that extends for several acres behind our house. We've got an old chicken coop back there that we don't use anymore, and the smell seemed concentrated around that area. As I approached the coop, the smell became almost unbearable. I was about to turn back to get a flashlight. It was dusk by this point, when I decided to open the window of our kitchen, which faces that direction, to try to pinpoint where the smell was coming from. That's when I heard it, a sound that instantly took me back to that day on the Batenkill. It started as a high-pitched, prolonged scream that gradually dropped in pitch until it became a deep guttural roar. The closest comparison I can make is to imagine a coyote howl combined with a lion's roar, with the bass and volume of what you might imagine a T-Rex would sound like. It was so loud and so unexpected that I physically jumped back from the window. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, echoing across our property. Every hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. It wasn't coming from the distance. Whatever made that sound was close, just at the edge of the woods behind our chicken coop. When it finally stopped, I realized I'd been holding my breath. The sudden silence was almost as unsettling as the scream had been. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to process what I'd just heard. I'm not someone who spooks easily. My military training taught me to assess threats objectively, to react based on facts, not fear. But in that moment, every instinct I had was screaming danger. About a month later, my wife and daughter came home from shopping and rushed into the house looking rattled. They'd been unloading groceries from the car when they heard a series of distinct knocking sounds coming from the woods behind the chicken coop, like someone striking a tree with a heavy stick or rock. Thump, 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 clear, deliberate, evenly spaced. Then they heard footsteps, heavy ones, moving through the underbrush. My wife said she could actually feel the vibration through the ground, like something very large was moving quickly away from our property. She grabbed our daughter and they came inside immediately. I went out to investigate, taking my flashlight and sidearm. Old habits die hard. There was nothing obvious to see, no tracks I could discern in the leaf litter, no broken branches at human height. But something about the atmosphere back there felt wrong. The woods were dead silent, no insects, no birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush. Just complete, unnatural silence. After researching similar experiences online, I've come across countless accounts of these same phenomena. Rocks thrown as warnings, strange screams or howls, wood knocking, and that distinctive, horrific smell. Many people associate these signs with Sasquatch or Bigfoot activity, suggesting they're territorial markers or communication methods. I don't know what to believe. I've always been skeptical of cryptid stories, always assumed there was a rational explanation for supposed sightings, but I can't explain what happened on the Batenkill, or the scream I heard in my backyard, or why my wife and daughter felt the ground trembling from something moving through the woods. What I do know is that these incidents follow a pattern. They all seem to be warnings of some kind, signals to back off, to leave an area, to understand that we're not welcome in certain spaces. The rock thrown near our boat, but not at it. The scream that could have been made much closer to our house, but wasn't. The knocking sounds that preceded whatever was moving away, rather than toward us. It reminds me of tactics we used in the military to warn people away from restricted areas. Escalating signals designed to communicate, "Don't come any closer," without immediately resorting to direct confrontation. It's almost like whatever is out there is following a similar protocol, giving us clear but non-lethal warnings to respect some boundary we didn't know existed. I've installed game cameras around our property since then, particularly near the old chicken coop and the woods beyond. So far, they haven't captured anything unusual, at least nothing visually. But twice now, I've found the cameras moved, pointing in different directions than where I set them up. Not knocked down or damaged, just adjusted, as if something had carefully redirected their field of view. Last week, something new happened. Something new. I was taking out the trash at dusk when I heard 3 distinct knocks from the woods, the same pattern my wife and daughter had described. Instead of going inside, I stood my ground, curious if anything would happen next. After about 30 seconds of silence, there were 3 more knocks, much deeper in the woods this time, like whatever made the sound was moving away. On an impulse, I picked up a stick and knocked 3 times on our fence post. The response was immediate and chilling, a single powerful impact against a tree that sounded like someone had hit it with a sledgehammer, followed by what I can only describe as a warning growl, low and rumbling, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I went inside after that, my heart racing. Whatever was out there, it was responding to me, communicating. And that's perhaps the most unsettling realization of all. Not just that something unknown is in these woods, but that it's intelligent enough to establish and enforce boundaries, to warn rather than attack, to respond when addressed. Some nights now, I sit on our back porch after my wife and daughter have gone to bed, just listening to the woods. Most times, there's nothing unusual, just the normal chorus of insects, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant yipping of coyotes. But sometimes, usually when the wind is blowing toward our house from the forest, I'll catch that smell again, just faintly. Or I'll hear a single knock, like a reminder that something is still out there, still watching. I keep a journal now of every unusual occurrence, dates, times, weather conditions, phases of the moon. I'm looking for patterns, trying to understand the rules of whatever uneasy coexistence we've established with whatever shares these woods with us. Because that's how it feels, like we're engaged in some slow, cautious negotiation of boundaries with something that was here long before we built our house. Something that's willing to tolerate our presence as long as we respect certain limits. Last night, I was awakened around 3 in the morning by the sound of our dog whining at the back door. She's not usually one to need to go out in the middle of the night, so I was immediately alert. When I let her out, instead of running into the yard to do her business, she stood rigid on the porch, hackles raised, staring toward the old chicken coop. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it, that same sense of being watched that I'd experienced on the Batenkill. The air felt heavy, charged somehow, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Our dog, who normally fears nothing, refused to step off the porch. She just stood there, trembling slightly, a low growl building in her throat. Then I heard it. 3 knocks closer to the house than ever before. Not threatening, not aggressive, but unmistakably deliberate. A message. I waited, heart pounding, wondering if I should respond. Before I could decide, our motion sensor light clicked on, illuminating the yard between the house and the chicken coop. There was nothing visible, nothing moving. But as I watched, a single rock, about the size of a baseball, rolled out from the darkness beyond the light's reach and stopped in the middle of our yard. It hadn't been thrown, it had been rolled gently, purposefully into the light where I couldn't miss seeing it. Message received. This is as far as you should come. I called the dog back inside, locked the door, and spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching that rock in the middle of our yard, wondering what would happen if I went out and rolled it back. I'm still wondering.